Have you ever accused someone of projecting something onto you? For example, let's say you had a manager who clearly felt inadequate in their leadership skills. But instead of acknowledging their own feelings of insecurity, they projected those feelings onto their team. Maybe the manager started accusing team members of being incompetent or not pulling their weight, insisting that they weren't really meeting expectations, when actually it was clearly the manager who wasn't up to snuff. Or to pick a different psychological term, your partner or coworker always seemed to be trying to one-up their sibling. If their sibling buys a new car, they have to buy a new car. If their sibling gets a promotion, they suddenly start working extra hard. Maybe they have an obvious case of sibling rivalry. Or perhaps you've known someone with a pretty close relationship with their mom. Like, what exactly is going on there? Close. And little alarm bells go off in the back of your head. Oedipus complex, Oedipus complex. Projection, sibling rivalry, Oedipus complex. Did you know that all these terms were invented by Viennese psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud? Born in a small village of the Austro-Hungarian Empire called Freiburg in 1856, Sigmund Freud didn't seem destined for much at birth. His father was a wool trader who didn't have much success, was even implicated in some criminal activities, and if he hadn't been, life was always unpredictable and difficult for Jews living in Europe in the 19th century. Most could only realistically hope to survive, eke out a meager living, support their family, not thrive. But when the Freud family moved to Vienna when Freud was a little boy, young Sigmund found himself immersed in a so-called Jewish Renaissance, a period of time in which Jewish intellectuals were making massive contributions to medicine, culture, the arts, literature, and politics, and being financially rewarded for doing so. His parents must have been so pleased to see Freud become a doctor, improving the status of his family and community, but Freud wasn't really interested in what happened in the body. He wanted to know what happened in the mind. Freud wanted to investigate the psychological processes behind polite society, how people hid their demons away, put them in a locked box for only themselves to see, at least until they had some kind of breakdown. And in Freud's mind, all of these demons were based in one thing: sex. Lucifina loomed large in Freud's mind. Over his career, he developed a field of psychoanalysis, the process of getting patients to reveal their hang-ups and frustrations, to understand the strange symbols that plagued them in their dreams, to address the weird fears that they'd had ever since childhood. And Freud thought it all came back to sexuality. And that led him into some pretty strange places. In addition to developing many psychological terms that we're familiar with today, he also developed some that psychologists now consider wildly wrong, like the idea of penis envy, the theory that girls experience a sense of inferiority upon realizing they do not have a wiener, leading to feelings of envy and a desire to possess one. And then he said girls secretly want their fathers to impregnate them so that they can have a baby that acts as their surrogate penis. Does that resonate with a lot of you lady suckers? That you either view baby boy as your substitute cock and balls, or that you want a baby boy, ideally fathered by your father, so you can finally have some vicarious baby schlong? No? Are you sure? Are you just not willing to address and deal with your unconscious desires? I can't help you if you refuse to be honest. Stop being hysterical. And this is even more insane, Freud believed that a child's development somehow hinged on them learning to shit right and not withholding their shit from the toilet. That's where we get the term anal retentive. And it gets even stranger. But also, he had a lot of really good insights as well. Remarkable ones, in fact. It'll be a fun mix of, oh my God, that's brilliant, and what in the actual fuck today. The life and theories of Sigmund Freud on today's psychological, historical, possibly one of the horniest episodes we've ever had edition of Timesuck.
This is Michael McDonald, and you're listening to Timesuck.
You're listening to Timesuck.
Well, happy Monday and welcome to the Cult of the Curious, you beautiful bastards. Happy Thanksgiving to everyone listening in the States or expats abroad. Get that gravy. Get it. Eat it till you have to undo the top button of your jeans. Lay down on the couch now. I want to get inside your mind. Find out what's really going on in there. I'm Dan Cummins, turkey killer, Dr. Suckmaster, licensed therapist in the sense that I do have a driver's license, and I did once have a job with therapist in the title. A dick factory supervisor. And you are listening to Timesuck. Hail Nimrod, hail Lucifina, praise be to good boy Bojangles, and glory be to Triple M. No announcements today. Time for a topic that, though intellectual and historical, would also be, if someone were coming up with it today, probably considered some of the most wackadoodle shit out there. At least by some of us. Millions would probably find it just as valid as the certainty of an adrenochrome harvesting reptilian deep state. For just a few examples of how crazy this stuff gets, Freud believed that almost every act was at its core sexual, even breastfeeding as a baby. So many horny-ass babies in Freud's worldview. And in one essay about the unheimlich, what people find uncanny or frightening, Freud presented a hypothesis that neurotic men find female genitalia, quote, uncanny, because they fear being symbolically buried alive by returning to their mother's womb. Totally. God, whenever Lindsay wants me to go down on her, I am paralyzed with fear, especially if she's on top in that regard. I mean, I'll do it, but only if you promise not to suck me into your womb. Pinky swear this isn't a trick. I'll service your bicycle, I'll lube up your chain, but only if you don't pull me up inside your gears. Freud even believed that the clitoris was inherently masculine, and having a clitoral orgasm was a sign of mental illness and or a cause of lesbianism. Of course, you ladies can't get enough of your vibrating wands. You're fucking insane. You're so crazy you seem to actually enjoy bringing pleasure to yourself. Pleasure that we men, frankly, aren't even needed to be around for you to have anymore. But please let us at least watch. Hail Josephina. Freud was also susceptible to the trendy but misguided medical fads of his day, like the therapeutic use of cocaine, which does sound amazing at first. Why can't my doctor prescribe me an 8-ball or 3 of high-grade Columbia nose candy that I know hasn't been stopped with any fentanyl? That would definitely cure me of my winter blues from time to time. I know it would. Come on, doc, you fucking teetotaler. You read enough stuff like that and you get less of a portrait of a prestigious intellectual when thinking about Freud, more of a picture of a coked-out guy making crazy conjectures about human behavior. And indeed, critics have found much to tussle with Freud. His critics have accused him of placing far too much weight on sexuality as a driving force in human behavior, neglecting other important influences such as social, cultural, and environmental factors. Freud also largely left women out of the psychological conversation in many ways, since Freud had let's call it a very limited view of women and female sexuality. Adding to that, many of Freud's theories, such as the Oedipus complex and the idea of repressed memories, lack robust empirical support. It seems Freud himself, while coining the term projection and understanding it intellectually, may himself unknowingly been projecting his own horn dog desires and wildly neurotic hang-ups on the rest of us. Critics argue that his theories were based more on anecdotal evidence, a strong personal bias, and clinical observations rather than solid scientific research. And some of the evidence he did gather was undoubtedly tainted by his putting pressure on his patients to give him the feedback that he wanted. Good old authority bias, right? The tendency to automatically accept and value the opinions of someone perceived as an authority figure, often without critically evaluating their validity, leading individuals to tailor their responses to please said authority figure. But despite all of that, Freud truly was a genius, a highly intelligent man with incredible observational skills, a remarkable ability to offer new insights into the workings of the human mind. Before Freud, there were really only 2 approaches to thinking about mental life and behavior. One was scientific and deterministic, with the brain controlled by the laws of physics and chemistry. Right? Seen this way, as soon as we could thoroughly dissect and examine the brain and understand its mechanical operations and map out how different parts of it work chemically, as if we were studying any other organ like the heart or stomach, or as if we were automatons with computers in our heads instead of not as predictable as a machine, wildly complex organic tissue, we would know everything there was to know about human behavior. The other pre-Freudian view was common sense psychology. Common sense explanations for behavior in terms of thoughts, wishes, feelings, hopes. Someone behaves in X way because they want Y thing. Very straightforward. Freud saw things differently. He believed that much of human behavior is driven by complex unconscious motives, desires, and conflicts. And unlike common sense psychology, he saw that the person who had these conflicts often wasn't even aware of them. Basically, we're all a bunch of hot messes. Freud felt these mental processes would manifest in dreams, slips of the tongue, as in Freudian slips, and neurotic behaviors. That was all new in Freud's day. And if you believe his case studies, his approach really did help cure many of his patients of their mental ills, or at least relieve their symptoms for some time. Or maybe they just thought their symptoms were relieved for some time because he was prescribing them so much cocaine. Let's find out. Not much to go over in regards to today's episode structure. Keeping it straightforward to help keep this from being any more confusing than it inherently is. And I don't think it's all that confusing, by the way. Since Freud's theories are best learned about, at least I think so, in the context of the time in which he was writing about them, we'll learn about how his thoughts developed as he grew from a precocious young student to a scientist working in a lab, to a doctor, to a man with his own private practice, to the esteemed father of psychoanalysis. Before we do that, however, a couple of disclaimers. For starters, as there often are with historical topics, some of the dates in here are in question. The dates when Freud started such and such organization, for example. This is partially because Freud destroyed many of his personal documents out of fear that he had revealed too much about himself in private letters. He actually went out of his way to make it harder for biographers, specifically to understand what he was up to and what he was talking about. We've gone with what preeminent Freud historian Peter Gay has written about in his huge biography, Freud, A Man of Our Time. He seems to have the best, or at least one of the best understandings of Freud. There are so many people who have analyzed the analyst. There are more than 30 biographies of Freud in circulation today. Freud did a lot of studying of others, and a lot of others have studied Freud. This episode will also leave out some of the developments in psychology that Freud was a part of, like the founding of blah blah conference and blah blah institution. Just because there's so much material to go over that that some of the stuff is a little more relevant than others as far as how we understand the mind today, and that's what we'll be focusing on. And even what we will share will only scratch the surface of his body of work. He was prolific, to say the least. He wrote at least 22 books, published more than 300 famous works, articles, and anthologies, and case studies, and more. We've gone with the most important ones today, at least the ones we feel are the most important, the ones that you've probably heard of, but will nonetheless still make you go, what the fuck, when we really get into them. And get into them we shall in the timeline.
Strap on those boots, soldier. We're marching down a Timesuck timeline.
Sigmund Freud was born Sigismund Shlomo Freud, May 6, 1856, in Freiburg in Moravia, now a town called Pribor in the Czech Republic, but then part of the Habsburg Empire. 150 miles north of Vienna, it was a small market town, almost entirely Catholic, but with a very tiny Jewish community that Freud was a part of. His father, Jacob Freud, was a small-time merchant, trading mostly in wool, descended from Jews from the Rhine Valley in Cologne who fled east as a result of persecution there, found temporary refuge in Lithuania, and then returned to German Austria in the 19th century. His mother, Amalia Nathanson, was from Vienna and almost 20 years younger than her husband and either his second or third wife. Records are unclear on that front. Most seem to say third. Sigmund was the first of his parents' 7 children, 5 daughters and 2 sons, though his father had 2 sons from a previous marriage, Emmanuel and Philip, who were 23 and 26 when Sigmund was born. Amalia, meanwhile, just 20 when she gave birth to her first son. Both of his parents were Jewish at a time when being Jewish was not nearly as dangerous as it had been in previous centuries, but also still wasn't incredibly not dangerous either. 19th century Jews tended to be restrained by restrictions and prejudices and faced uncertain futures. They primarily had access only to the resources of their tightly knit communities, and they lived under a big cloud of suspicion. Though Jews like Sigmund's family were essentially middle class, the basic assumption of their lives was that there was nowhere that they could definitely settle long-term because they had no political or civic status anywhere in Europe, and they never knew when the next anti-Semitic tide would be rolling in. The new states that were emerging around this time, like Germany in 1866 and Italy in 1861, didn't know whether to treat Jews as a race or a religion. They were resident aliens wherever they lived, both essential to Christianity's history and, as many at the time perceived, Christianity's enemy. Their main source of continuity and stability resided in their family traditions and inherited religious ways. In the small Moravian town of Freiburg, where Freud was born, there were just 130 Jews, while the rest of the population of about 4,500 were Catholic. Today, the city sits in the Czech Republic, as I said, and is called Pribor. Perhaps this was why, when Freud's parents had gotten married in a Reformed synagogue, Jacob renounced the religion of his Hasidic forefathers. Jacob Freud intended to raise his sons, as children in general, in a sort of modernized cultural Judaism, not a religious one. Later on, Sigmund would describe himself as a, quote, godless Jew. Freud had zero use for the teachings of rabbis, or for religion in general, really. At least in a spiritual sense. Like to study it, didn't actually believe it. But though things were uncertain for the family's future and cramped as the Freuds lived on the top floor of a plain 2-story house above a blacksmith, sounds noisy, Sigmund had the security of being his parents' favorite. Amalia was completely devoted to her baby boy, her surrogate peen, whom she called Min Goldner Siggy, or my golden Siggy. Sister Anna once remarked, no matter how crowded our quarters, Sigmund always had a room to himself. No wonder he'd go on to talk a lot about sibling rivalry. Sounds like the rivalry was real in his house. I mean, how could there not be some sibling jealousy with old Siggy being given preferential treatment? Also, before moving forward, seriously, how much would it have sucked to live directly above a blacksmith? Just ping, 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 fucking all day, every day. That would drive my misophonia just insane. Amalia gave birth to another son, Julius, a year after Sigmund was born, but Julius would die as an infant. She gave birth to Anna the next year. Anna and Freud and Sigmund would be very close, him and his sister. Recalling these early years, once when he was adult, Freud would say that he quickly realized that his little sister had come out of his mother's body. What was harder to fathom was that he was slowly beginning to realize that his half-brother, Philip, was a better match for Amalia, Philip's stepmother, than his father was. Records are scarce, but historian Peter Gay seems to think that Philip and Amalia, possibly had an affair, which led to Anna's conception. So no wonder Freud was focused on sexual dysfunction. Also, is this common? Is this where all of our stepfamily porn online comes from? I'm sure Freud would have a field day with that, by the way. I told you we were obsessed with sexuality and family dynamics. Added to Freud's unusual family situation was the fact that his best friend was John, his half-brother Emmanuel's son, who was just a year older, but was technically his nephew. So Sigmund's family was full of odd arrangements. His mom was possibly impregnated by his half-brother, which would make Anna his sister niece. His nephew was older than him, and his father, almost 39 when Sigmund was born, was as old as many of his friends of the time's grandfathers. Also not lost on me that last week we walked through sister aunt territory, and now this week we might walk in through even creepier sister niece territory. And there was another thing. He had a Catholic nanny who taught him about her religion and who Freud later implied acted as his teacher in sexual matters too, even though he was only 3 when she left the home. So get the fuck out of here. He said she was sharp and demanding with the precocious little boy, and Sigmund loved that. He seemed to have an exceptional memory of what his thoughts were as a toddler. I don't know about you, but I have had very few memories of literally anything at all before about the age of 5. Freud said he felt betrayed when his half-brother / mommy lover, Philip, had the nanny arrested for theft while Amalia was recovering from giving birth to his sister Anna, perhaps his sister niece. All of this, some historians think, created what would become the foundation of Freud's psychological theories: complex, sexual ties within families. When Sigmund was 3.5, his father's business collapsed and the family moved first to Leipzig in Germany for a year and then on to Vienna, where Freud would live for the overwhelming majority of his life until 1938. Workers all over Europe were migrating to the cities for work at this time. Jews of Jacob's generation especially had realized that they could no longer sustain themselves in small, rural Jewish communities and villages. Times they were changing, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing, and a new era of modern living had begun. Between 1840 and 1880, over 200,000 European Jews would migrate from small communities into the cities of Europe, mostly in Western Europe, in search of work. Part of this migration, young Sigmund found himself in a completely different environment than the one he had been born into. A multicultural imperial city known for its opera, fine arts, and literature. Europe's third most populous city in Europe at the time after London and Paris. In 1857, Austrian Emperor Francis Joseph had decided to have the military defenses surrounding Vienna destroyed, and the new available building land was immediately incorporated into planning programs, including the Ringstrasse, the splendid boulevard of stately public buildings I would love to visit someday. Looks beautiful. Designed in the new style of the day, new government departments, museums, the court, the opera, the parliament building, and a new university. Many other structures went up. The Ringstrasse was used for military parades, other celebrations of imperial might. Horse-drawn trams began to run in 1868, and in the 1880s, Emperor Francis Joseph turned a former hunting preserve on the Danube River over to the city as well. This will become another historical gem. The new park, the Prater, had some 3,200 acres, and by the end of the 19th century offered something for almost everyone. Had paths for walking, riding horses, bicycling, lakes for boating, soccer fields, an amusement park with a large Ferris wheel, Europe's largest outdoor theater. Vienna was a long way from the tiny pastoral village where Sigmund had been born. His parents moved into a house in Leopoldstadt, the traditional Jewish district of Vienna. The Freuds were embraced by a thriving Jewish community in the middle of what historians term the Jewish Renaissance of Vienna. Jews met regularly at the Schloss Temple, a magnificent synagogue, or I guess Stott Temple. a magnificent synagogue in which the Hebrew language and traditional prayers were retained, which had been built by Joseph Kornhusel in 1826, the first legal synagogue to be opened in the city since 1671. And still, though, even though it was legal, it had to be hidden from the street according to Viennese law. Imagine that happening now with any church. Absolutely, you can build a First Baptist, Pastor Johnson. Just not here, where people are going to see it and stuff. I don't care, but it upsets us, just in general. Well, we tolerate you, but we don't like you. How about you just, how about you just put your church in that building over there, but just don't make any signage saying that it's a church. Make it just look like a warehouse or something. And then people can just come in from the alley behind it, just quietly. They can just come in and leave quietly. Yeah, that's how it was for the Jews of Vienna. And it was way better than it had been, previously, and better than it would be in the near future. And also better than Jews had it in most parts of the rest of Europe. In 1867, things got a little better for Vienna's Jews, and full citizenship was given to them, leading to a large influx of Jewish immigrants from the eastern part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, especially from Bukovina, today part of Ukraine and Romania, Galicia, today part of Ukraine, also Poland, Czech lands, and Hungary. And because of that, Jews became predominant in all spheres of life and contributed greatly to Vienna's cultural and scientific achievements. There was Jewish merchants, traders, entrepreneurs. Their businessmen became prosperous. Many of Vienna's most celebrated artists and intellectuals were now Jewish, which would, of course, sadly anger many non-Jews in the wake of, World War I, lead them to thinking, what are they doing that we aren't doing? Why aren't we rich too? They're valuing education more, that's what. A number of Jewish institutions were established in Vienna, including a Rothschild hospital in 1872, a Jewish gymnasium, a Jewish pedagogium founded by the chief rabbi of Vienna. And so unlike his ancestors and even his father, Jacob, Sigmund grew up with a true home. Vienna, a place where, prior to the rise of the Nazis, many Jewish people felt was a place where they could firmly establish roots and stop running. Sigmund's mother, Amalia Freud, would have a child every year for the first 4 years of their life in Vienna. Rosa, born in 1860, Marie in 1861, Adolphine, 1862, and Pauline, 1863. Her last child, Alexander, would be born 3 years later in 1866. The break in children was due to Amalia spending most of 1864 and 1865 in bed with her pussy on ice in order to reduce swelling from knocking out 4 humans in 4 years. Kidding, of course, but my God. I don't even have a pussy, but it hurts thinking about being pregnant that much. Because of all these new children, the family struggled for money, a situation which was exacerbated by the indictment, conviction, and imprisonment of Sigmund's uncle, his father Jacob's brother Joseph, for trading in counterfeit rubles. There's some evidence that Jacob and his 2 older sons had a role in Joseph's scheme, and if so, this would match up with Sigmund's assertion that his dad was unusually anxious around this time and that his hair quickly turned gray. In this unsteadiness, Sigmund relied more and more on his mother for comfort and stability. Since she was almost always pregnant or postpartum, poor woman, he always felt he had a rival for her affection and attention. And this may have manifested in a sort of sexual obsession. When he was 4, Sigmund would later write, he saw his mother naked for the first time and that his, quote, libido matrum awoke for the first time, or his, quote, want for his mother. I must have really deeply repressed memories of my early lust for mama. And later as well. Later lust, for that matter. The thought of having sex with my mom makes me sick. Or does it? Do I just think that trying to see my mom as a sexual object is impossible, as it literally makes me want to throw up, like actual nausea? But really, that's because my unconscious lust is so great, I'm afraid it'll consume me if I ever acknowledge or give in to it. Doth I protest too much? God, I hope not. Another formative experience in the realm of psychology would occur for Sigmund when he was 7. Apparently, he was urinating in his parents' bedroom, hopefully into some type of toilet or chamber pot, it's not mentioned, and not like, on the floor in the corner, when his dad responded by saying, exasperated, that boy will never amount to anything. Dad seems pretty disappointed about him peeing. Maybe he was pissed on the floor. This must have been a terrible affront to my ambition, Freud wrote much later, for allusions to this scene occur again and again in my dreams, and are constantly coupled with enumerations of my accomplishments and successes, as if I wanted to say, you see, I have amounted to something after all. Whether or not it had anything to do with peeing on the floor or elsewhere, Sigmund would develop into a very ambitious boy. As the eldest son now, at least at home with his father's 2 eldest sons, with his first wife out of the house, for several years now, it would be Sigmund's responsibility to continue improving the status of his family and Judaism at large, preferably by becoming a doctor or a lawyer and contributing to Viennese culture. Sigmund was eager to do just that. He had seen his father fail to become a distinguished businessman, and he wanted to succeed where his dad hadn't. At the age of 8, he began to read Shakespeare, and along with Goethe, Shakespeare would remain his favorite author for the rest of his life. Beginning at the age of 9, he attended the Sperl Gymnasium, where he was an extremely successful student. "I was at the top of my class," he wrote in his autobiographical study. "For 7 years, I enjoyed special privileges and was required to pass scarcely any examinations. He read widely, but was particularly good at languages, soon more than competent in Greek, Latin, Spanish, Italian, French, English, but not Hebrew. He was never particularly interested in Hebrew or much of anything traditionally Jewish." Also, anyone else love hearing about kids going to school at the gymnasium? That word in relation to being a school always cracks me up, since the gymnasium was a place where I had, PE, and it was just called the gym. Hearing about young Freud taking all of his classes at the gymnasium makes me picture little Sigmund having to duck dodgeballs while studying Latin, take a history test right after trying to climb to the top of the rope as fast as he could, maybe after doing some burpees or running suicides or something. Ancient history did fascinate Freud, especially the civilizations of Egypt, Greece, and Rome. He was also getting interested, unsurprisingly, in sex. In 1872, when he was 16, he returned to his birthplace of Freiburg for a visit. One of his traveling companions was Edward Silberstein, his most intimate friend of these identity-forming teen years. The two had formed an exclusive secret Spanish academy, which had no other members. They playfully addressed one another by the names of two dogs in one of Miguel de Cervantes' tales and exchanged confidential letters in Spanish. In one emotional communique, Fred confessed to an agreeable, wistful feeling over his friend's absence and to his longing for some heartfelt talk. Another of his confidential messages to his Queridismo Berganza bears the caution, "May no other hand touch this letter." Historians generally think that it was around this time that Freud had his first same-sex romantic relationship, most likely with Edward. But he had other crushes in Freiburg, too. The 13-year-old Gisela was the sister of his friend Emil Fluss, and he briefly fell in love with her, only discovered that it was really her mother that he wanted. Plot twist! It would seem, he wrote to his friend Silberstein, that I have transferred my esteem for the mother to friendship for the daughter, and I am full of admiration for this woman whom none of her children can fully match. Is admiration code for boner here? I feel like it is. I am full of boner for this woman whom none of her children can fully match. I think so. Also, I would love it if some of you started to express your romantic desire for others in that way. "Maria, please don't go. I need you. I'm full of boner for you." Perhaps these early sexual feelings and experiences got him to thinking about what he wanted to be, how to use his interests to drive his professional life. At the age of 16, he wrote to his friend Emil Fluss that it gave him pleasure to, quote, "apprehend the thick texture of connecting threads that accident and fate have woven around us all." Dude was a seeker. Wanted to understand what the meaning of life really was, what his purpose was within that meaning. I like that. He also knew that he wanted to know more about what people were thinking than they were typically willing to share. He once complained to Edward Silberstein, that you have only let me, quote, "that you have only let me have a selection from your experiences, but have kept your thoughts wholly to yourself." This actually resonates with me a lot. Not even kidding. I think it actually explains part of what drew me to studying psychology in college. Something I didn't really fully realize until now. I just want to know what people really think because I've long thought that what most people claim they think, what beliefs they tell me they hold dear, are a bunch of bullshit. I don't think that many, if not most people's actions line up with their claims, right? They say one thing, but they do another. It drives me crazy. Probably what led me to be, transparent to a degree that honestly some people in my family are a little embarrassed by. I've been told by numerous family members over the years, some version of, you don't have to share all your secrets. Or, I didn't need to hear that. Or better yet, no one needed to hear that. My banana peel fucking bit for a stand-up special I did a while back, being one of many examples, it's not that I don't have any shame or that I'm not embarrassed by certain thoughts I've had or behavior I've engaged in. I just really want to know what people truly think, what they've truly done, so I can have some understanding of what normal is, of what it is to be human, So I share my authentic self, hoping I'll get some authenticity in return. And there are a lot of, authentic, real people out there, but I think we're vastly outnumbered by people who, aren't willing to really live an authentic life, which I find both sad and frustrating. They hide, they lie. I feel you, Freud. I feel you. Maybe not on the mom fucking stuff. Sorry, bro. Genuinely have never wanted to fuck my mom, to my knowledge. I did have sexual feelings for my stepsister when I was in high school, though, if I want to be fully honest. And I definitely thought a few of my first cousins were hot growing up. Right? And there I go again. A little too much honesty, probably. Very thankful in this moment that my mom does not listen to this show. Yeah, Freud, like some of us, wanted to know everything. Not just languages, history, other school subjects, but what was happening in people's minds. Who were the people around him truly? Fuck yeah, bro. Me too. Freud left school in 1873 to 1873 to go study at the University of Vienna. He was 17 years old. Originally, he planned on studying law, but in May of 1873, he declared his intention to become a scientist. I have determined to become a natural scientist, he wrote to his friend Emil Fluss, in a metaphor that playfully referred to his ongoing interest in law. I will examine the millennia-old documents of nature, perhaps personally eavesdrop on its eternal lawsuit, and share my winnings with with everyone willing to learn. I have the toughest time sometimes with these old letters because I like to narrate in a rhythm, and the way they wrote back then just fucking jams up my speaking pattern. But anyway, I love that. But a catastrophic stock market crash on May 9th, 1873 led to anti-Semitic outbursts in the press as journalists held Jewish bankers responsible for the collapse, making Jewish bankers scapegoats. Far from anything new. Vienna University's campus, too, proved to be experiencing a new wave of anti-Semitism. When in 1873 I first joined the university, Freud wrote later, I experienced some appreciable disappointments. Above all, I found that I was expected to feel myself inferior and an alien because I was a Jew. I refused absolutely to do the first of these things. I have never been able to see why I should feel ashamed of my descent or, as people were beginning to say, of my race. Yeah, he was never able to see why he should feel ashamed of his race because he was logical, not an ignorant fuckhead. No, I feel like some people just forget that no one gets to pick where they were born. No one gets to pick what race they are. If your biggest point of pride is your heritage, if your biggest point of pride is like where you're from, you're probably somebody I would consider a huge loser. Winners, in my opinion, go out and make a name for themselves by their character and or individual accomplishments. They don't lean on or care about race or birthplace, since race and birthplace, not things you earn. While losers denigrate the unchangeable attributes of others, like race, to make themselves feel better for not accomplishing shit as an individual, and instead looking to what race and situation they were born into as their own personal point of pride, which is just preposterous. This illogical hate and discrimination Freud faced made him even more passionate about the universal language of science, something that applied to all people, something that connected them across cultural and social boundaries. Meanwhile, his father Jacob began to enjoy a modicum of affluence, most likely because his two older sons, once settled in Manchester. They both moved there initially, had done well there and were giving him some money. Yet even after he could afford servants, the painting of his 7 young children, expeditions to the Prater, and more spacious living quarters, he and his family still made do with a relatively modest 6-room apartment they moved into in 1875 when Sigmund was a university student. Alexander, the youngest child, Freud's 5 sisters, their parents all crowded into 3 bedrooms. Yeah, it wasn't a 6-bedroom apartment, just 6 rooms total. Meanwhile, Sigmund had his so-called cabinet for his private domain, a room, quote, long and narrow with a window looking over the street, and it was crammed with books. And that's where Sigmund studied, slept, ate his meals to save time for reading. When he came out of his room, he was an attentive but somewhat authoritarian brother, helping his little bro and sisters with their homework, but also lecturing them, especially when he found his sister Anna with books he considered too risque. By this point, both Jacob and Amalia thought of their son as exceptional and pretty much did anything he wanted. For example, when he complained about Alexander's piano playing, they just got rid of the piano. Yeah, I'm sure Alexander was fucking pumped about that. Holy shit, talk about favoritism. And I imagine that led to some siblings resenting him just a little bit. Deep into his schooling, Freud still didn't know exactly what it was he wanted to become. As late as his 3rd year at the university in 1875, Freud was still thinking of, quote, acquiring a doctorate of philosophy based on philosophy and zoology. Perhaps to get some perspective, Sigmund took a trip to Manchester to visit his half-brothers. England and English literature had preoccupied him since boyhood. He loved England just as much as he thought he would. He was also inspired to recommit to Darwin, famous Englishman, and to pursue medicine, not philosophy now. Upon his return, he started concentrating his work in the zoologist Karl Claus's laboratory, even setting out for a visit to Trieste, a seaport in northern Italy, in 1876 when he was 20, to see if he could observe testicles in eels, who were thought to be hermaphroditic. After dissecting some 400 specimens, still couldn't find any gonads. Love they did that. It's so weird. Sig, how was your summer? Pretty good. Spent most of it in Italy looking for eel cock and balls. Either they don't have any or my eyes just aren't that good. Hoping he came back home, he started calling his little brother Alexander Eelnuts. Hello, Mother, Father. Good to see you, Anna, Rosa, Mitzi, Dolphy, Pauline. Sup, Eelnuts? Just fucking squirrels him. Looking for them tiny-ass eel balls actually did help Freud develop a skill of patient and precise observation, something he would find incredibly important with his later human subjects when he was trying to find their nuts or something. That same year, he would also begin to research at the Physiological Institute of Ernst Brücke, a professor whom he greatly admired, who exercised a considerable influence upon his thinking. Brücke and his co-workers were dedicated to the idea, then not widely accepted, that all vital biological processes could ultimately be explained in terms of physics and chemistry. This was in opposition to the widely held view of vitalism, that living things have a vital force or principle that is not biological, some type of vital spark or vital force that equated with the soul. But Brücke and others thought that living things didn't necessarily have some magical force that animated them. It was the same biochemical processes that made up non-living things, just on a more complex scale. A year after Freud began working at the lab in 1877, he published his first paper, the beginning of a series about how nerve cells and nerve fibrils function as a unit. In 1879 and 1880, he was forced to take a year off for compulsory military service. For Freud, this obligation largely meant tending to a few sick soldiers and being bored. Freud spent most of his time translating 4 essays by John Stuart Mills. His peers and superiors did praise Freud as being honorable, cheerful, very eager, very reliable, and very considerate and humane. Freud's fascination with research, far more than compulsory military service, ended up slowing him down towards getting his doctorate. He wouldn't get his medical degree until the spring of 1881, when he was 25, wouldn't leave the lab until the summer of 1882, when he took a junior post at Vienna's General Hospital, leaving behind his treasured lab with Brücke. Maybe it also took Freud a little longer than his peers to graduate because he didn't really want to practice medicine, but he felt like he was supposed to. Why? Well, because it paid and he needed money. And not because he had some kind of gambling problem or addiction, but because he wanted to get married and get out of his parents' house. In April of 1882, he had met a young, foxy lady named Martha Bernays, who was visiting one of his sisters. And he was full of boner for her. Completely full of boner for Martha. He actually was. She was slender, lively, dark-haired, a pale girl with expressive eyes. Freud was hooked. They got engaged June 17th, only 2 months after their first meeting. Their union might have been a case of opposites attract. Freud was already firmly an atheist. Martha was a devout Orthodox Jew, granddaughter of the chief rabbi of Hamburg. Their partnership was based on love and lust. Martha Bernays had social prestige, but no money. Freud had neither. Ernest Jones, a Welsh neurologist and psychoanalyst who had become a lifelong friend and colleague of Sigmund Freud, following their first meeting in 1908, said that Freud sent over 900 lengthy letters to his fiancée during their courtship. Almost 1,000 letters. Letters which charted the ups and downs of a tempestuous relationship marred by outbreaks of jealousy on his part, as well as affirmations of, I love you with a passionate enchantment, that kind of stuff. He was madly in love with her. He would overcome his jealousy, and they would go on to have 6 kids together. When they later married, it was already apparent that Freud was undeniably brilliant, but he didn't have much of a direction, career-wise still, no immediate prospects for a grand career. And he had nothing to expect from his aging father, who now needed financial assistance, from his 2 oldest sons, as I went over earlier. When Freud really needed money, he would borrow it from a fatherly friend and mentor, Joseph Breuer, an Austrian physician, 14 years his senior, who he would develop the so-called talking cure with a patient that would become the basis of Freud's psychoanalysis. But Freud couldn't depend on leaning on his father's generosity forever, his friend's generosity forever. His friend who was like a father. So he decided to go into private practice, feeling that path would give him enough money to sustain a middle-class family. But in order to prepare for his own medical practice, Freud first had to gather clinical experience with patients, experience he could not get in a laboratory environment. So he would now go to work at a local hospital for 3 years, moving from department to department: surgery, internal medicine, dermatology, nervous diseases, ophthalmology, and psychiatry. He rose in the ranks from clinical assistant to the position of secondary doctor in May of 1883 when he joined Theodore Meinert's psychiatry clinic. Then in July of 1884, he became a senior doctor, and a few months before that, he had developed an interest in something else. In the early spring of 1884, he reported to his fiancée Martha that he'd become interested in the properties of sweet cocaine. Cocaine was then a little-known drug in Europe, which a German army physician had been employing to bolster his men's physical endurance. Yeah, I bet it bolstered their endurance, at least in the short run. Right, in the short term, might have led them to seeing a lot of shit that wasn't actually there, becoming more than a little unstable and twitchy in the long term. To quote the legendary Rick James, cocaine is a hell of a drug. It might or might not amount to anything, Freud told Martha, but he planned to experiment with its possible uses in alleviating heart trouble and cases of nervous exhaustion, such as a, quote, miserable condition that came upon people when they withdrew from morphine use. He had no idea he would be getting patients to trade one addiction to a powerful and addictive drug for another. Freud completed a technical paper on coca, a fascinating compound of scientific reporting and strenuous activity. Or fascinating combination of scientific reporting and strenuous oh my God, I can't read. And forget that entire sentence. Freud completed a technical paper called On Coca, and it was a fascinating combination, that's one word, of scientific reporting and strenuous advocacy in June, and published it in a Viennese medical journal the following month. Here are some fun quotes. Cocaine has a paralyzing effect on frogs after a short period of excitement. Poor frogs, man, they probably started hopping around like crazy until they almost OD'd. Cocaine causes in rabbits many different kinds of spasms, an increase in breathing rates, dilation of the pupils, and death, accompanied by convulsions. Dude, giving the bunnies way too much fucking Florida snow. An absorption of 0.01 grams of cocaine per kilo in dogs shows obvious signs of the most joyful excitement and a maniacal urge to move around. Oh, fuck yeah. Making Bojangles shake his ass with the big C. About to wag that tail the fuck off. One more quote. On the first occasion, I took 0.05 grams of cocaine. One suddenly became cheerful or becomes cheerful, and a feeling of lightness occurs. There occurred a short stage with toxic effects, which I noticed were absent later. Breathing became lower and deeper, and I felt weak and sleepy, had to yawn frequently, but then found myself in considerable high spirits. After a few minutes, the real state of cocaine euphoria began. One feels an increase in self-control, feels revitalized, better able to work. Unlike alcohol, one feels simply normal and soon finds it difficult to believe that one is under the influence of anything. Long-lasting and intensive intellectual and muscular work is accomplished without fatigue. And the needs of nourishment and sleep, which would have otherwise imposed their demands at certain times of the day, have been dispelled. Oh yeah, man. Before you get addicted and starts to ruin your life, before all that not eating and sleep deprivation finally catches up with you, cocaine's the best. Freud's discovery of cocaine's ability to block pain would quickly lead to some of his colleagues thinking it would be great to use for local anesthesia for surgery. Early in September, Freud went off to see Martha Bernays, but not before mentioning his work with cocaine and its properties at once soothing and stimulating to his friend Leopold Königstein. When Freud returned to Vienna after this interlude, he discovered that not Königstein, but another associate of his, Karl Kohler, quote, to whom I had also spoken about cocaine, had performed the decisive experiments upon the eyes of animals and had demonstrated them at the Ophthalmological Congress at Heidelberg. And now Freud felt they had stolen his thunder and his chance at celebrity. Pissed off and depressed that he was no closer to marriage and family life, Freud began taking the drugs as a stimulant to control his intermittent, terrible moods, improve his general sense of well-being, help him relax in intense social encounters, and just make him feel, fucking good, more like a man, like a golden god. He even sent large quantities of coke to Martha, urged her to use it, and then he would continue to use it himself into the late 1890s. So Freud was still doing a lot of blow in 1885 when he attained the coveted rank of university lecturer. It was a prestigious position, but there wasn't a salary attached. It was thought that most who attained this rank would become professors. Even though he climbed the ladder another rung, Freud still found himself no closer to being able to afford a marriage and family life. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Freud now found himself entertaining hostile fantasies, including death wishes, against colleagues standing in his way. Oh, I'm sure the coke helped with that too. He later mused about these days, wherever in the world there's rank and order promotion, the way for the wishes are required to suppression lies open. That's probably how he said it. But what he wrote is, wherever in the world there is rank, order, and promotion, the way for wishes requiring suppression lies open. That kind of sounds like a coked up thing to say. By this time, Freud was thinking more and more of turning to psychiatry. And at this point, not because that's where his greatest passions lied, not quite yet, but because he really needed the money. However, it was still a little practice branch of medicine in Vienna, so he would likely have to go somewhere else to learn, like Paris. So that's what he did. March of 1885, Freud applied to his faculty for a travel grant, got a meager stipend, 6 months to leave, and he took it. He arrived in Paris in mid-October, spending his first weeks there exploring the city, high as fuck on cocaine. He watched various theatrical productions from the cheap seats, drank inexpensive wine. Then for some 6 weeks, he worked on the microscopic study of children's brains in Jean-Martin Charcot's pathological laboratory at the Salpêtrière. Jean-Martin Charcot was an interesting guy. Born to a poor family in 1825, his father decided that the son who performed best amongst the four in school would go on to receive a higher education, a competition that Jean-Martin won. It's fucking pretty crazy. Imagine your parents make that deal with you and your siblings. Like there's four of you. You know, your dad's like, hey, one of you, good news, one of you is going to college. The smartest one, the best one, my favorite. The rest of you lot, well, best of luck. After finishing medical school, Jean-Martin went on to become a professor of pathological autonomy, and he was particularly interested in the burgeoning field of neurology. Working at the overcrowded Salpêtrière Hospital, where nearly 3,000 patients suffered from neurological diseases, Charcot focused on distinguishing mental illnesses from one another and from physical illnesses. For example, when someone was paralyzed without having been physically injured, were the same physical processes behind the paralysis as they were in someone paralyzed from a direct injury. Through hypnosis, Charcot showed that paralysis in someone who was not physically injured directly was a psychosomatic illness, an affliction not based in physical reality, but in the patient's ideas about their bodies. Based in their mind-body connection. And it's crazy that our minds are that powerful, right? Charcot demonstrated that such paralyses could be cured and then artificially produced again by hypnotic suggestion. And he seemed to like Freud and want to take him under his wing. In January and February of 1886, Freud was invited to various receptions at Charcot's palatial house. Feeling awkward and uncertain of his abilities with speaking French, before he went to the first little reception, Freud did a bunch of blow. Got high as fuck. I'm fluent in French now, baby. Oh, oui, motherfucker. Oh, oui, baguette, menage à trois, bonjour, merci. Give-moi that white lady, Marie Antoinette. He actually did show up super high. Fortified himself with a hefty dose of coke, dressed formally, and headed on over. I just pictured him with just so much powder on his face. Charcot found him very lively. Oh, I bet. And charming. Sometimes drugs do actually help you. It's not a good rule to live by. But in certain instances, it is true. Doing coke before the party did make Freud more likable, did help his career. Freud now became more and more devoted to Charcot's model of medical intervention, taking his patients' outlandish behavior seriously and entertaining out-of-the-box theories about what was going on inside of them. Once back in Vienna, he now felt he had only one calling: to bring Charcot's way of doing things, including hypnosis, to the Austrian Empire. And to help give himself the strength and energy to do that, he kept doing a lot of blow. He submitted a report to his medical faculty back in Austria around Easter 1886 that spoke about the importance of bringing Charcot's theories to German-speaking lands. Charcot used to say that, by and large, anatomy has finished its work, and the theory of the organic diseases might be called complete. Now the time of neuroses has come, he wrote. Freud's peers didn't believe him at first, but Freud continued diligently translating Charcot's works and quoting him as an authority. He also resigned from the General Hospital in Vienna, did exactly what he had been intending to do. He started a private practice. He put out an advertisement in Vienna's new free press on April 25th that listed his home address, home and office being one and the same, and read, Dr. Sigmund Freud, docent for nervous diseases at the university, has returned from his study trip to Paris and Berlin and has consulting hours from 1 to 2:30. Some of his colleagues began to send him patients, and soon, with some case studies now under his belt, he began giving lectures, like one in the fall of 1886 to the Vienna Society of Physicians on male hysteria. One old surgeon objected to Freud's thesis that men could be hysterics. Did not the name hysteria, from the Greek word for womb, make it plain that women alone could suffer from hysteria, he said. I mean, come on, bros. Only women can be crazy, right? I mean, right? We men are always level-headed and stable, right? Cut to Hitler and most of his henchmen being born just a few years later. Anyway, while other physicians were more receptive to his ideas, Freud was a bit of an all-or-nothing guy. He now considered himself in opposition to the medical establishment. He was a renegade. He was a rebel dotty. Despite Freud's ideas not being quickly embraced by all of his colleagues, he was making money. And now his savings, along with his fiancee's dowry, wedding presents of cash and generous loans from wealthy friends, he was able to get married. The civil wedding took place in Hamburg, Germany, September 13th, 1886. Freud brought so much boner to this date. But a religious ceremony was required under Austrian law, so Freud, the avowed atheist, gave in, had a religious ceremony the following day, September 14th. Then in 1886, he and his new bride moved into an apartment house built on the site of Vienna's Ring Theater. which had burned down with more than 400 fatal casualties 5 years before. That is quite a fire. Then after a year of marriage, he had splendid news for his family. On October 16th, 1887, he had the best boner he had ever had. Just like the greatest, like the hardest, maybe even a tiny bit longer. It felt like it almost glowed. And he showed it to the family. No. On October 16th, 1887, Martha would give birth to the couple's first child. Her own boner. She would give birth to her, actually no, his daughter. Matilda, I'll stop talking about boners. Freud reported with his characteristic self-deprecating pride, she weighs 3,400 grams, which is around 7.5 pounds, which is very respectable. She is terribly ugly. Sucked on her right hand from her first moment, otherwise seems very good humored, and behaves as though she is really at home. I like that. She's an ugly but respectable baby. Meanwhile, it was around this time that Freud was becoming dissatisfied with the available therapeutic techniques for handling his neurotic patients. They weren't working. So he began working hard to create some new techniques. In 1891, the same year that he and his family moved into an apartment at the Bargasse 19 in Vienna, where he would practice for almost 50 years until 1938, where he would write many books, including his first titled On the Conception of the Aphasias, a critical study, published in 1891. Aphasia is a language disorder that affects a person's ability to understand and express written and spoken language, primarily associated with brain trauma. Soon, however, he turned the focus of his work to neurasthenia, a condition that causes chronic fatigue, exhaustion, headaches, insomnia, and irritability. And this is where he really gets into sex and the relationship between sexuality and psychological maladies. In early 1893, he wrote, "These guys just need to get their dick sucked, bruh. I'm so fucking hyped about how getting your dick sucked will cure any and all mental maladies. Also, check out this shit. I've increased my daily cocaine intake to 2 grams. Holy fuck, I'm a living god. Like I'm actually a deity. No one around was able to see it, but I know I was levitating this morning in my study. 100% for sure. Hopefully the coke will cure my recent bout of impotence as well. Oh, one more thing. Sometime shortly after snorting cocaine, a little man comes out of this hiding place in the wall between my office and the hallway, telling me that my father never loved me, my mother wouldn't fuck me even if I was last on earth. I spoke with the building's landlord several times now, and he has promised again to check the wall, and I found get a little roommate and leave the building." No. In early 1893, here's what he really wrote. "It may be taken as well known that neurasthenia is a frequent consequence of an abnormal sexual life. The assertion, however, which I should like to make and test with observations, is that neurasthenia can in fact only be a sexual neurosis. Based on his interviews of his patients, he believed that they were telling him stories of childhood sexual abuse, which led to their neuroses and other mental health problems. This would be called Freud's seduction theory, a theory that stated that repressed memories of childhood sexual abuse were the cause of hysteria and obsessional neurosis. Freud published studies on hysteria, co-written with his mentor Joseph Breuer in 1895, but the most historic case within the work had actually taken place 15 years earlier in 1880. It was this encounter with the patient listed as Anna O that would go down in psychological history. The woman's real name kind of sucked. Bertha Pappenheim. And Freud correctly hypothesized that no one would give 2 shits what happened to a woman named Bertha Pappenheim. In his observation, the mere mention of the name, Bertha Pappenheim, elicited nausea in males and a deep melancholy in females. Joking, but that was actually a real name. While Bertha Pappenheim was Breuer's patient, it was Freud who interpreted her case later and made it, her into, as Breuer himself said, the germ cell of the whole of psychoanalysis. So let's meet her. In 1880, when Anna fell ill, she was 21 and a woman of many talents and positive character traits. She was kind, philanthropic, energetic, clever, came from a very straight-laced Jewish family, and her father doted on her. The event that led her to her so-called hysteria was the illness and death of her beloved father. During the 3 months she nursed him, she felt increasingly weak and developed a severe nervous cough. Then her vision began to fade. By December, she was squinting, unable to see for more than a few feet. She was now suffering from headaches in addition to disturbances in her vision and also partial paralysis. Then in early 1881, things got even weirder. She began to experience mental lapses, long episodes of abnormal drowsiness, rapid shifts of mood, mounting difficulties with her speech, hallucinations involving black snakes, skulls, and skeletons. At times, she regressed in her syntax and grammar. At other times, she could only speak English or only speak French or Italian. Then shit got weirder still. She developed 2 distinct personalities, one listed as being unruly. And no one wants to see an unruly Bertha Pappenheim. Unruly Bertha Pappenheim will send shivers down deep into your very soul. Then in 1882, Anna began to struggle to drink water, even when she was parched. Then, while in a hypnotic state, she told Dr. Brewer that she had seen an English acquaintance of hers, someone whom she intensely disliked, letting her little dog drink out of a glass. Once her suppressed disgust came out into the open, the hydrophobia disappeared. She could drink water again. This was a huge breakthrough. Going forward in sessions with Dr. Brewer, with every odd behavior that Anna presented with, she was able to trace it back to an incident that had occurred during her father's illness. And when she figured out where each behavior came from, it went away. This led Dr. Freud and Dr. Brewer to later conclude in their book, Studies on Hysteria, "For we found, to our great surprise at first, that each individual hysterical symptom immediately and permanently disappeared when we had succeeded in bringing clearly to light the memory of the event by which it was provoked and in arousing the accompanying effect, and when the patient had described that event in the greatest possible detail and had put the effect into words." They also wrote famously, "Hysterics suffer mainly from reminiscences." Or what we might call trauma today. Sounds so quaint when you call trauma a reminiscence. Feeling down today? Just stop reminiscing about being molested by that friend of your dad's for 3 years, you silly goose. Enough with the reminiscing. Come on. Language is a funny thing. Unpacking Anna's trauma was not easy. Her recollections were often hazy. Her symptoms often appeared at the moment she was about to make a breakthrough. But by June of 1882, Brewer noted, in conclusion, literally all of Anna O's symptoms were gone. Bertha Poppenheim was back, baby. She'd returned to who she had been before her dad had gotten ill. Or had she? 3 months after her symptoms disappeared, she lost the ability to speak, understand, or read German, and suffered from intense bouts of pain and occasional blackouts. But still, I guess she was better. She functioned better. She would function well enough to become a pioneer and social worker and a leader in feminist causes and Jewish women's organizations after this. Based on what they learned from Anna O, Freud and Brewer postulated that the physical symptoms expressed the patient's feelings in symbolic fashion. Thus, constriction in the throat might express an inability to swallow an insult, or a pain in the region of the heart might signify that the patient's heart has been metaphorically broken or damaged. And then there were some other things Brewer left out of the book that Freud would pick up and run with later, like the fact that some of Anna's behavior seemed related to her sexuality. For example, she experienced a, quote, hysterical pregnancy, like she wasn't actually pregnant. She believed that she was pregnant with Dr. Brewer's child, and Brewer found this deeply disconcerting. He had never had sexual relations with Anna. Freud found it fascinating. It would ultimately lead him to his theory of transference, a psychological phenomenon that occurs when someone redirects feelings or desires from one person to another. So in this case, from her father to Brewer, is what they thought. Freud theorized that she had transferred fantasies she had had about her dad to Brewer, the new male authority figure in her life, one that also gave her a lot of attention. Brewer was weirded out by this possibility. He imagined the relationship between the patient and doctor as a clinical one, sanitized of any improper attachments. But Freud wanted to push ahead with this new line of reasoning. He felt like he had landed on something that could be truly revolutionary. So throughout the rest of the 1880s, he started collecting case studies that would become the basis for Studies on Hysteria, his next book, or another book of his, taking a brand new approach. He started disregarding patients' medical histories and probing them for their personal histories, early traumatic experiences that transformed into sexual conflicts that were hidden from even the sufferers themselves. He also gave up on hypnotherapy entirely. He knew that he needed his patients to be emotionally present for their moments of self-discovery. That was what would cure them, he felt. And he did have success with this new method. An early win was the case of Elizabeth von R., a woman whose first neurosis manifested when Freud pressed and pinched her thighs during a physical examination and she became aroused. What the fuck? Why was he pinching her thighs during a medical exam? Hey, baby, how's your visit to the doctor today? Interesting. Not bad. He pinched and poked my inner thighs till my pussy got really wet. Hey, did you grab light bulbs and garbage bags from the store? Wait, what? Light bulbs and garbage bags. No, I heard that part just fine. Let's back up and talk about the doctor and your wet pussy again. Her face, Freud wrote, assumed a peculiar expression, one of pleasure rather than of pain. She cried out, somewhat I could not help thinking as with a voluptuous tickling. Her face flushed, she threw back her head, closed her eyes, her trunk bent backward. Things getting steamy. According to Freud, she was experiencing the sexual pleasure she had denied herself in her conscious life. He didn't accept it when Elizabeth told him that she was not thinking about anything when he touched her. He pressed deeper and deeper, getting her to admit everything to him. And then he came all over. He discovered that a single lightning bolt moment was rarely enough. Traumas had to be worked through. The final ingredient in Elizabeth von R's recovery was an interpretation of the evidence that Freud offered and that she resisted for some time. She loved her brother-in-law and had repressed powerful sexual longings for him. Oh, she wanted her brother-in-law's cock so bad, right? And she'd been repressing that ever since her sister's death. Her acceptance of this immoral wish put an end to her suffering. Maybe. To be fair, later in life, Elizabeth, actually a woman named Iona Weiss, would say she was not actually in love with her brother-in-law, but she had somehow been cured of the severe pains in her legs she had whenever she stood or walked during her sessions with Freud. Another patient of Freud's was a young woman who found it impossible to leave her room or receive visitors without having urinated a number of times. That sounds crippling. Freud traced the origin of the symptom to an occasion on which the woman had been in a theater, had found herself so strongly attracted by a particular man that she experienced genital sensations, which had led her to wanting to urinate and to being compelled to leave the theater. Since that occasion, she had feared a repetition of the sensation. What if her naughty little clit got to tingling again? What if her underwear became moist with sexual arousal? Oh, God! I should just lay down and die then, oh Lord! Because of this, she had replaced the fear of her erotic impulses with a fear of being unable to control her bladder. Based on cases like these, Freud would develop an idea that would become the underpinning of much of his life's work. Actually, probably underpinning is what I was trying to say there. This idea was that was a dominating principle of mental life, the idea was that a dominating principle of mental life was the strong desire of the person to reach a state of tranquility by completely discharging and becoming free of all tensions. Sounds nice. Sounds very nice. This would later be renamed the Nirvana principle. And this fits in perfectly with Freud's new theories about sexuality, because how better to achieve tranquility than through orgasm? You keep working on these ideas and seeing patients who are now coming to him more and more after the publication of studies on hysteria. He got so busy, he was able to raise his rate. Now he made more money than he had before. Even though he held strict criteria still for who could become a patient, they should possess, quote, a reasonable degree of education and a fairly reliable character. That's pretty funny. A doctor, can you cure me? Perhaps. Are you well educated and not a rogue, rascal, or rapscallion? Doctor, I'm afraid I am a bit of a rascal. Then no, I'm afraid I cannot. And then cut to him pointing to a sign hanging on his office door that just simply states, no rogues, rascals, or rapscallions. Freud also preferred his patients to be below 50 years of age and ideally a teenager. As Freud would later write, old people are no longer capable of being educated. God damn. While persons under the age of adolescence are, quote, often exceedingly amenable to influence. God, soon there will be no hope for me. I won't be able to be re-educated anymore. I'm going to talk like this forever. Freud also refused to take on patients who were psychotic, that is, people who were suffering from schizophrenia or from the most severe types of melancholia, aka depressive illnesses. Finally, they would have to be okay with lying on a chair that faced away from Freud for their sessions. Freud had a couple reasons for this. The first was that he felt this encouraged a flow of free association. He also hated being stared at for 8 or more hours a day. Fair. Third reason was that Freud was frequently full of boner. He liked to beat off while he listened to his patients. And turned him off when they caught him. No. Third reason was that Freud thought the patient shouldn't see the psychoanalyst changing facial expressions. Freud would not take notes either. He thought the analyst needed to maintain an evenly suspended attention. Was that a good memory? Apparently, there were enough people in Vienna who wanted this, and Freud was able to make, pretty decent money. That was a good thing, because by this time, he needed a lot more money because he was snorting so much fucking coke. Woo-hoo! Let's talk about that fucking trauma, brother. Let's talk. Let's talk all night. Snort on this white shit with me. Speed up our progress. Rub it on your fucking gums. Talk to me, goddammit. No. But he was actually doing a lot of coke in 1895. The reason he needed more money was because he and Martha had 6 children now. After Matilda in 1887, there was Martine in 1889, the Freud children, Oliver in 1891, Ernst in 1892, Sophie in 1893, and Anna in 1895. Martha looked after the children with her unmarried sister, Minna, while Freud smoked cigars, his ultimate vice. He loved cigars, while he saw patients, published papers on hysteria, obsessions, phobias, and more. And maybe he was also fucking his sister-in-law, Minna. Maybe. Carl Jung, another one of the world's most influential psychologists ever, and a man who would have a really interesting relationship with Freud, we'll get into more of that later, would say in 1957 that during his first visit to Freud in March of 1907, Minna actually told him of her sexual intimacy with her brother-in-law Freud. Specifically, Jung recalled that Minna Bernays, quote, was very much bothered by her relationship with Freud and felt guilty about it. From her, I learned that Freud was in love with her, and that the relationship was indeed very intimate. It was a shocking discovery for me, and even now, right, May of 1957, I can recall the agony I felt at the time. And then in 2006, potential proof of the affair was uncovered in the form of an old hotel registry from a Swiss resort in 1898. Seems Freud and Minna had checked into a hotel room together, registered as a married couple. First he wanted to fuck his mom. Then he was probably fucking his sister-in-law. No wonder he was so focused on sexual dysfunction. His life was full of it. He was perhaps projecting it on the world. On the evening of April 21st, 1896, Sigmund Freud presented a paper before his colleagues at the Society for Psychiatry and Neurology in Vienna entitled The Etiology of Hysteria. Dr. Richard von Krafft-Ebing, Dick Kraft, we talked about him in a short suck on clinical vampirism, a German psychiatrist focused on sexual pathology, was presiding. Using a sample of 18 patients, male and female, from his practice, Freud concluded that all of them had been the victims of sexual assault by various caretakers. This was where his research on sexuality had led him. He proposed that adults who experienced sexual abuse as a child suffer from unconscious memories and feelings incompatible with their present-day experiences and develop psychiatric disorders because of that. Freud published 3 papers on the subject in a matter of months, though he left out the exact stories of sexual abuse, thinking the medical community would not be able to handle them. It'd be too scandalous. He did say, however, that these memories were 100% genuine, and more specifically that the patients were not simply remembering the events as they would normally forgotten material. Rather, in therapy sessions, they were essentially reliving these events with all the accompanying painful sensory experiences. However, in the following years, Freud would abandon this view. Freud didn't publish the reasons that led to his abandoning his seduction theory, but he did write to his friend and confidant, Wilhelm Fleiss, September 21st, 1897, a few reasons why he felt that, quote, seduction theory wasn't holding up. The main reason he said was that it seemed very improbable that fathers all over the fucking place were continually molesting all of their children. Fair. Freud's own father had died in October of 1896, and though Freud experienced disturbed sleep and heart palpitations for a while, he couldn't come up with a single instance of sexual abuse at the hands of his father. And that is something I would imagine, he would have tended to remember, especially with his memory. Such widespread perversion against children is scarcely probable, he wrote. But more importantly, he argued, the unconscious is able to distinguish fact from fiction, is unable to distinguish fact from fiction. In the unconscious, there is no sign of reality, only feeling, so one cannot differentiate between truth and fantasy. Sounds like he is laying the groundwork here for the concept of false memory syndrome that would come to be defined many years later in 1992, drawing on research from the 1970s. False memory syndrome is a psychological phenomenon where a person strongly believes they have memories of a traumatic event, particularly childhood abuse, that did not actually happen, often emerging during therapy sessions, in particular hypnosis sessions. Leading questions from the therapist cause the patient to imagine various scenarios, and when they awaken from hypnosis, they quote-unquote remember these imagined events as being very real events. This exact phenomenon led directly to the satanic panic of the 1980s, all sorts of people remembering being molested and over-the-top cartoonish satanic rituals that for sure never happened. Like proven in court, like, nope, fucking nonsense. Also led to a lot of people remembering that they had been abducted by UFOs. That's happened over the years. Claims that have frequently been debunked. And I know, new evidence came out about the existence of UFOs recently. I'm a believer. Just don't believe all the hypnosis bullshit. Finally, you don't have to be hypnotized to experience false memories. Lots of people have been led to believe that things happened that really didn't while being questioned by the police, when having a therapy session that they are fully conscious for, etc. And it's possible, if not probable, that many of Freud's patients were making up these experiences. Not that they were totally fake, but, they imagined instances of sexual abuse. They were actually manifestations of something within the person's mind, something that had been developing since childhood, not something that actually really happened. Okay. So this leads Freud to his theory of infantile sexuality. Not the idea that sexuality was being forced prematurely on kids, but that kids had their own sexual relationships to objects as early as infancy, and those relationships developed over time. And this would be revolutionary, not for simply connecting sexuality to childhood, but for proposing that children developed, kind of like at all. The idea that children were just small adults was the prevailing view of childhood during much of history, still held by some during the 19th century. Honestly, how the fuck can anyone ever think that like a toddler or even a grade schooler is a mini adult? I feel like in order to think that, you've either never been around kids, or you just don't pay attention to how kids act when you are around them, or you're stupid. Like my kids in early grade school still couldn't seem to detect a feeling of dried spaghetti sauce or ice cream on their faces, left over from the last meal or maybe even left over from 2 meals prior. Still had no concept of personal space. They would seem surprised to catch an elbow to the head, again, due to the head being at elbow height on me, which I told them repeatedly was a problem, and due to them trying to walk about 2 inches away from me at my side, walking in a straight line about as well as someone failing a DUI test. Again. And those are just two of about 1 trillion examples. Now we scientifically know that kids' brains are far from being fully developed. But even if there was no science, how would simple observation not tell you that? I guess I'm not really surprised. People believe that in general, though. I still see people treating little kids like adults. I had to wait an extra 30 seconds to a minute to walk into this coffee shop a few weeks ago because this toddler was just standing in the doorway, just blocking the doorway, just chilling. Looked like she was, between 18 months, 2 years old. Mom standing directly beside her, holding the door open, either not noticing that I'm standing right there, hoping to walk in at some point. Someone else is inside trying to walk out, or maybe she just doesn't care. No, she's busy talking to her toddler in an adult voice. Just saying stuff like, Sophia, let's go. Sophia, we've talked about this. Come on out. Sophia, mother's talking to you. Sophia, you need to listen. No, Sophia needs a new, smarter mom. Sophia needs her mom to walk out into traffic so that she can get an upgrade, potentially, when it comes to her primary care provider and perhaps be able to grow up and not be just as stupid as the human currently assigned to teaching her how the world works. That's fucking crazy. Why are you talking to a fucking 18-month-old like that? Pick Sophia the fuck up. Just get her out of the way. My dogs are smarter than her. This is madness. That's what a lot of people believed back when Freud was around. You know, little tiny kids. It's mini adults. Anyway, prior to Freud, the idea that children were just small adults was, again, the prevailing view of childhood. Other contemporaries of Freud, especially those who had been swept up in the romantic idealism of untamed human nature and utopias, they believed childhood was a pure time in a person's life when they didn't have any of the complicated thoughts or considerations of adulthood. Just blissfully happy little beings. Basically, this perspective saw children as living in this kind of Adam and Eve Garden of Eden situation, just blissfully unaware of the sins of the world. Freud knew that both sides were wrong. Children were not miniature adults, and they were not angelic creatures either. They were little fuckers, little walking cockblocks who just did their best to make sure you never get to have sex again or enjoy an uninterrupted phone call with friends or actually pick up, they're never going to pick up the shit in the yard for the dog they begged for like a year. Anyway, Freud thought sexual development could be traced across childhood with distinct phases. He proposed that personality development in childhood takes place during 5 psychosexual stages, which are 1 oral, 2 anal, 3 phallic, 4 latency, and 5 the genital stages. How is the phallic stage not part of the genital stage? And who's jumping into anal on step 2? What kind of poophole loophole bullshit are we talking about? I'll explain. During each stage, sexual energy, aka libido, is expressed in different ways and through different body parts. As a person grows physically, certain areas of their body, so-called erogenous zones, become important as sources of potential frustration, pleasure, or both. The oral stage, the first period of sexual development, occurs from birth until approximately 18 months. And during the oral stage, babies will focus approximately 60% of their overall energy towards trying to fellate themselves. No, that's too insane, even for Freud. During the oral stage, a baby's libido, or innate pleasure-seeking energy, is focused on the mouth, meaning they derive immense satisfaction from engaging in oral activities such as sucking, biting, breastfeeding, chewing various objects. Anybody who's seen a little baby teething knows that they're constantly trying to fucking nibble on shit. Freud believed this behavior would influence the development of a child's personality. He suggested that a child who is underfed or frustrated during feedings might become a pessimistic, envious, and suspicious adult. On the other hand, a child who is overfed or overly gratified could become optimistic, gullible, and full of admiration. So a friend of mine who believes everything anyone around them says and is constantly at risk of being taken advantage of from scammers either spend too much time sucking on mama's sweet teats or gorge themselves too often on Gerbers. Got it. Freud hypothesized that a person fixated on the oral stage might engage in excessive eating, smoking, nail biting, or becoming overly talkative, symbolizing the continued fulfillment of oral needs. And in the case of sexual perverts, a particular preoccupation with cunnilingus and fellatio, or even with kissing, to the detriment of coitus, which Freud considered the most important thing above all, putting the P into the V, would be deemed evidence of persisting oral psychopathology. So if you prefer blowjobs or cunnilingus to intercourse, you're a lunatic. That's what I took away from that. The second stage is the anal stage of psychosexual development, occurring between the ages of 18 months and 3 years. During the anal stage, the libido becomes focused on the anus, and the child derives great pleasure from taking a shit. Seriously. Do you have a little poop lover? Someone who thinks that number 2 is really number 1? The best around. No one's ever gonna keep the clown from pushing out the stinky brown is the best. You need to lock that animal in a cage. Freud believed this type of conflict tends to come to a head in potty training, in which adults impose restrictions on when and where the child can defecate. The nature of this first conflict with authority can determine the child's future relationship with all forms of authority. Early or harsh potty training can lead to the child becoming an anal retentive personality who hates mess, is obsessively tidy, punctual, and respectful of authority. They can be stubborn and tight-fisted with their cash and possessions based on the pleasure they experienced of holding onto their feces when their parents tried to get them to defecate. That seems like just a bit of a stretch. Love to hold in your poop when you were little? Oh, I bet you pinch pennies too. Freud believed the anal expulsive personality, on the other hand, underwent a liberal toilet training regime during the anal stage. An adult, they might be messy, disorganized, and rebellious. Might have to check in with my mom about this one. I'm messy. I'm a bit rebellious. Did I just get to shit where I please growing up? Toilet or closet, diaper, or dropping off some homemade Snickers in someone's dresser drawer? Now on to the third phase, the phallic stage. This period is marked by the child's libido focusing on their genitals as the primary source of pleasure. In this stage, children become increasingly aware of their bodies, exhibiting a heightened interest in their own genitals and those of the opposite sex. Additionally, their understanding of anatomical sex differences begins to form, sparking a complex mixture of emotions: erotic attraction, rivalry, jealousy, resentment, and fear. During this stage, children experience an unconscious desire for their opposite sex parent and jealousy toward their same-sex parent, leading to an Oedipus complex in boys or an Electra complex in girls. In the young boy, the Oedipus complex, or conflict, arises because the boy develops sexual desires for his mother. He wants to possess his mother exclusively and get rid of his father. Irrationally, the boy thinks that if his father were to find out about all this, his father would take away what he loves most, his wiener. Hence, the boy develops another Freudian term, castration anxiety. Please don't cut off my wiener. Confronted by what he perceives as a horrifying threat to the most precious part of his body, the small boy unconsciously abandons his hopes of sexual union with mommy, identifies himself with his potentially aggressive father, finally turns his attention towards securing sexual satisfaction from other feminine sources. Okay, I gotta say, I remember fearing that my dad would give me a spanking, ground me for a long time. Don't remember thinking he would take my penis. I mean, I feel like that would be a fear I would remember. Please, Daddy, don't take my dick. The girl, meanwhile, covets her father, yet recognizes that she lacks a penis, leading to a phenomenon Freud labeled as penis envy, a repression of her own inferiority. Apparently, the little girl then begins to fantasize that her father will impregnate her. I'll have to ask my daughter Monroe about this. I'm sure that won't fuck her up at all. Hey, when you were little, did you want to do me, you little creep? I mean, that's fine, right? That's a healthy question for a parent to ask their kid. No, I'm never talking to her about any of this shit. Freud believed that years later, the daughter having her own child would compensate the girl for her lack of a penis, and in this sense, might be said to be a substitute for the missing organ. I know I already asked you ladies up top, but again, does that ring true? Did you want to get pregnant and have a little boy so you could kind of sort of have your own peen? A dick you could share with your son, but not in a creepy way. Actually, there's no way for a mom to share her son's dick that's not creepy. That's insane. What brings this what the fuck is happening here stage of emotional development to a conclusion is the girl's growing perception of other men as potential impregnators who will enable her to have a baby and thus overcome her continuing sense of being an inferior kind of human being. Okay? So women who never have baby boys, who never get the sense of completion from some sort of dick loan for their son, just remaining complete and extra neurotic forever. I feel like Freud had just a bit of a blind spot here when it came to ladies. Didn't quite think all this through. Guy clearly didn't know many women who didn't have kids back in the days before reliable birth control. Freud believed that both little boys and little girls would have to engage in significant repression to get away from these feelings. But Freud also theorized that unresolved conflicts during this stage could potentially lead to a future issue, sexual dysfunction, problems with gender identity, or difficulties in forming relationships. So don't repress it all too hard. In men, he believed that phallic fixation might result in anxiety about sexual performance, the need for reassurance and validation, or a tendency to be overly assertive or aggressive. In women, fixation at the phallic stage could lead to a desire to dominate men, a rivalry with other women, or the need for male attention or approval. So don't be too horny. Both genders might see sex as a display of aggression or dominance rather than as part of a healthy relationship. Now for the fourth stage, the latency stage. The fourth stage of psychosexual development spans 6 years, about 6 years to puberty. Freud believed the libido was dormant during this stage and no further psychosexual development occurred. In this stage, Freud believed sexual impulses were repressed, leading to a period of relative calm, full of other pursuits like education, friends, and hobbies. But this stage could also be derailed. If the young person didn't do well at school or making friends, they could become an isolated and insecure adult. This stage ends with the onset of puberty, when sexual urges resurface and the individual enters the final stage of Freud's psychosexual development, the genital stage. During this stage, libido reemerges after its latent period and is directed towards peers of the other sex, marking the onset of mature adult sexuality. This period marks the onset of romantic and sexual emotions as well, leading to the formation of intimate relationships and ultimately settling down into a loving relationship, ideally. But in any of these stages, the child might experience failure, parental and societal disapproval, and thus might associate anxiety with the given erogenous zone. To avoid anxiety, the child becomes fixated, i.e. preoccupied, with the psychological themes related to the erogenous zone in question, and this could manifest in neurosis, hysteria, or personality disorders. However they managed to repress it, it was bound to come back up in one way or another, and one of those ways Freud thought was in dreams. Right? That dream, you had where you were walking around naked in front of your in-laws? Well, you had it because you came too fast. First time you had sex with Susie. And that's why you now hate redheads with big boobs, like your mother-in-law. It's also why sometimes you get a boner for no reason at all. But if you think about it, it usually happens when your dog's in the same room. So what's that about? It's about Susie and your dog and your mother-in-law. You wish you could fuck them all at the same time because you're a psychopath. And you should drown yourself in a river before you hurt somebody. Or something like that. I'm still working on my Freudian psychoanalysis abilities. I'm not quite licensed yet. But for real. Freud thought a lot of our sexual neurosis-induced repressed hang-ups would reveal themselves while we slept in our dreams. Indeed, he had been preoccupied with dreams for a while now. Back in 1895, he'd spent the summer at a place called Bellevue Palace, just outside of Vienna. Freud had been treating a patient whom he called Irma that summer, and at one point he had proposed some particular treatment solution that Irma was not willing to wholly accept. One can only fucking imagine how crazy it might have been. Irma, you fucking snort all that blow, that big pile, now. When Irma's treatment was not totally successful, he blamed her for not doing all that he asked. After some time had passed, Freud visited with a colleague who knew Irma, asked about her condition. Freud was informed that Irma was better but not quite well. That night, July 23rd, he had a dream that would become known as Irma's injection. Sounds creepy. He described it as follows. A large hall, numerous guests, whom we were receiving. Among them was Irma. I at once took her to one side as though to answer her letter and to reproach her for not having accepted my solution yet. I said to her, if you still get pains, it's really only your fault. She replies, if you only knew what pains I've got now in my throat and stomach and abdomen, it's choking me. I was alarmed and looked at her. She was pale and puffy. I thought to myself that after all I must be missing some organic trouble. I took her to the window and looked down her throat, and she showed signs of recalcitrance, like women with artificial dentures. I thought to myself there was really no need for her to do that. She then opened her mouth properly, and on the right I found a big white patch. At another place, I saw extensive whitish-gray scabs upon some remarkable curly structures, which were evidently modeled on the terminal bones of the nose. I at once called in Dr. M, and he repeated the examination and confirmed it. Dr. M looked quite different from usual. He was very pale. He walked with a limp, and his chin was clean-shaven. My friend Otto was now standing beside her as well, and my friend Leopold was percussing her through her bodice and saying, she has a dull area low down on the left. He also indicated that a portion of the skin on her left shoulder was infiltrated. I noticed this, just as he did, in spite of her dress. M said there's no doubt it's an infection, but no matter, dysentery will supervene and the toxin will be eliminated. We were directly aware, too, of the origin of the infection. Not long before, when she was feeling unwell, my friend Otto had given her an injection of a preparation of propionic acid, and I saw before me the formula for this printed in heavy type. Injections of this sort ought not to be given so thoughtlessly, and probably the syringe had not been clean. Well, that was his dream, and Freud became obsessed with it. He thought it symbolized his guilt for not curing Irma, which was assuaged by Dr. M, who assured Freud that Irma's symptoms pointed towards a physical infection. This now allowed Freud to shift the blame to someone else, or in Freud's terms, it fulfilled a wish to avoid guilt. This gave Freud his concept of wish fulfillment, and he would soon believe that all dreams represented the fulfillment of subconscious wishes. He analyzed his patient's dreams as well as his own using free association and found that in nearly every case the content included wishes, even if it seemed to be the opposite of a wish fulfillment at first. And now he gets an idea for another book. November 4th, 1899, a substantial volume is published by Sigmund Freud, The Interpretation of Dreams. It was his first major attempt to set out his theories of a dynamic unconscious, a hidden network of desires, fears, and obsessions living inside all of the hornet's nest we have for brains, desires, fears, and obsessions that have been forced out of consciousness by a process of repression because they're scary to deal with directly. It's not easy, for example, coming to terms, ladies, with wanting to share your baby's dick, you fucking monsters. But Freud did seriously think that such thoughts and feelings would arouse a crippling amount of anxiety or self-censure if they became conscious. So they get put into dreams and fantasies. And in his book, he wrote that psychoanalysts should separate these dreams and fantasies into their components: manifest content and latent content. Manifest content refers to the literal elements of a dream, the images, actions, and events that are consciously experienced. 1 second, you're eating a sausage while riding high up in the sky in a hot air balloon, and you're pissed that you forgot to add ketchup to it. But you see your fourth grade teacher, Mrs. Campbell. She's holding a full bottle of ketchup and staring at you, but she doesn't offer any ketchup to you. So now you're thinking of taking it from her and tossing her overboard. But your grandparents' house is directly beneath you. And if you kill one of them by throwing your old teacher on top of them, well, you're going to ruin Thanksgiving for everybody. That's the manifest content of your dream, right? What you're seeing, maybe what you think you're feeling or you're in the moment of the dream. The latent content represents the hidden symbolic meanings concealed beneath the surface of the dream. That's sausage. It's not about sausage. It represents your lady's clitoris. You want to lick it. But Mrs. Campbell once made you feel weird about periods when you saw a tampon for the first time in a desk drawer she'd left open and it was laying next to a packet of ketchup. And you still associate periods to this day with ketchup and Mrs. Campbell, which makes you afraid to go down on your lady. Because what if you encounter any menstrual blood? And now you're going to feel like you just went down on your fourth grade teacher who reminded you of your grandparents because she was the same age as them. And who had a poster of a hot air balloon behind her desk on the wall that said, "Let go of everything that is weighing you down. Only then will you fly free." And when you looked at that poster and read that quote, you thought how funny it would be to throw Mrs. Campbell out of the balloon because she was weighing you down with homework. And that's when you started thinking about killing people. That's a latent content of your dream. Maybe. Or there might have been a fucking hodgepodge of manifest and latent content that I kind of threw together. Right? I'm still working, as I said, on my psychoanalyst degree. I'll stop trying to explain it. Let Freud do that. Freud argued that the true significance of a dream lies in its latent content, which can be unraveled through the process of analysis. And he offered 3 main lessons. Number 1, all dreams serve to fulfill our wishes, but most of them obscure which wish it truly is. For example, one of Freud's patients dreamed her youngest nephew, Charles, was lying dead in an open casket. When they analyzed her situation, it turned out that the dream, according to Freud, of course, was really about her suppressed love for a professor whose relationship with her family had gone awry. The last time she had seen him was at the funeral of Charles's older brother, Otto, one of the rare events they both attended. She felt her only way to see him again would be if Charles died, and that's what her mind then showed her. Now for the second lesson. There are 3 different sources for dreams: real life and recent events, childhood memories, and bodily stimuli. And then finally, the third lesson. Dreams are arranged through condensing, displacement, and coherence. Condensing is simply what it sounds like, taking various memories of experiences or experiences and turning it into one dream narrative. Displacement is when important matters are represented as trivialities, like you're really nervous that you won't have a good time at the prom, but the only reference to that in the dream is a wilted corsage. And coherence is the idea that no matter how different the actual events and memories are, your brain will always bring all your dreams' elements into a logical sequence. On the psychology side, that's pretty much what interpretation of dreams covered. But don't think that Freud had moved away from sex when looking at dreams. No, of course he hadn't. No. He wrote, the very great majority of symbols in dreams are sexual symbols. To that end, the book included salacious case studies of his patients' dreams, like a woman who had dreamt that she put a candle into a candlestick, but because the candle had broken, it would not stand up properly. And in the Freudian universe, that was obviously representing a flaccid penis. And while that might be seen as fairly tame now, it was shocking to read in a book in Freud's day. A book that said, a candle is an object that can excite the female genitals. When it is broken so that it cannot stand properly, this signifies the man's impotence. When Freud probed the woman about it, she recalled that once in a rowboat on the Rhine, she and her husband had been passed by another boat, with students animatedly shouting a song about the Queen of Sweden, who, with her shutters closed, and she couldn't hear, something was said, with Apollo candles. She didn't get it. But her husband explained to her that the missing word was masturbates, and Apollo was a brand name of candles. And then I imagine her husband silently wept over having a spongy ween in the days before Viagra. In the book, Freud also discussed his own dreams, how he often dreamt of his accomplishments. He thought because of the incident when he urinated in his parents' bedroom at 7 years old, and his dad said he'd never amount to anything. He really couldn't let that one moment go, could he? His parents went out of their way to give Freud more space in their home for years than any of his siblings. They supported his education and career, but he focuses on that one time his daddy snapped at him. Interesting. Do you have a similar standout memory from your own childhood? One that haunts you or motivates you or both? A stepmom of mine, once told me that I wouldn't amount to anything after a big nonsensical tongue lashing, kind of her specialty. And while I don't think about it a lot, it definitely has motivated me to work to prove her wrong in the past, even long after she died. And I bet if I would have ever asked her about that moment, she probably wouldn't even have remembered saying it. I wonder if Freud's father would remember saying that to him. Funny how someone can say or do something to you, not even remember it, but it can impact your life greatly. With my own son, Kyler, he became in high school very unemotional for a few years, very flat. And I was getting worried. I was checking in with him about that. Something had happened. I don't remember what. And it felt like the kind of thing that would lead a person to cry. And it seemed like he was holding his emotions in. And then he ended up telling me that he hadn't cried in like 2 years or something. And talking about that led to him telling me that he had stopped crying altogether because I had told him to stop crying. Turned out it was a huge misunderstanding. When he was in 3rd grade, he cried so often, we would get a weekly cry report from his teacher, sometimes multiple times a week. He would cry because his assignment was too hard. He would cry because some kid sitting behind him farted. And then he asked the kid to stop doing that, and the kid farted again. That's a real example. Broke down in tears. He cried because some kid told him that he was the worst basketball player he'd ever seen. He cried because some kid didn't like his new shirt, and on and on and on. So I had some talks with him in grade school about how, if you cry all the time, it can lead to other kids not wanting to play with you, to making fun of you, to get you to cry more. We talked about not putting so much weight in the opinions of those around you, about toughening up a bit. And I'm sure I snapped a few times at home in moments of frustration, said something to the effect of, Kyler, stop crying, buddy. Come on, it's not that big of a deal. Some of you saw my stand-up bit I did a while back on the road that I never recorded or haven't released about, staple myself in the arm to show him that, and then not crying to show him, how you don't have to always react to stuff in a big way. It was a little psychotic. But anyway, he took my talks as don't ever cry in any situation. And then I felt terrible. Never had any intention of that being the message, but that's how he took it. And he dwelt on it to an unhealthy degree. And he cries now, by the way, if you're worried, when the moment warrants it. But yeah, just an example of how a childhood moment or a small collection of moments between parent and child that mean nothing to the parent, that are pretty forgettable really, can weigh so heavy on the kid that even decades later, when they're far along into their adult life, it still affects them greatly, as it clearly affected Freud here with his moment with his dad. Freud sharing details like that, like he did in his book, was shocking for an intellectual of his day to share. While the book would go on to be a famous work, it would take a little while, was not immediately a hit. His dream book, far from it. In the course of 6 years following its first printing, only 351 copies were sold total. A second edition not called for until 1909, nearly a full decade following the first edition. And the first edition only had 600 books printed. Meanwhile, Freud was working on another book, they provocatively titled The Psychopathology of Everyday Life, which he would complete in January of 1901. This was the text that would coin the term Freudian slip, when you mean to say one thing, but you really say something else that lets on what you're actually thinking about, like calling your partner by your ex's name. Like in his study of dreams, Freud believed that various deviations from standard behavior, especially when it came to language, were manifestations of unconscious thoughts and impulses. Backing up just a little to 1900 now, to talk about his psychoanalytic practice. That year, Freud would see a patient he called Dora, who would become one of his most famous case studies. Dora was an explorer with a bilingual backpack and a monkey named Boots. No, it's a different Dora. This Dora was an 18-year-old girl, the daughter of an unhappily married couple who were close friends of another unhappily married couple, referred to by Freud as Herr and Frau K. Frau K, I guess to be Herr and Frau K. Frau K was also the mistress of Dora's father, and Dora had a crush on her. So complicated and twisted. Dora wants who Daddy wants. Also, Frau's man, Herr K, had made sexual advances towards Dora when she was 14, which she violently resisted. When she was 16, she declared her hatred of Herr K, said that he had again made sexual advances towards her. Now she began to develop hysterical symptoms of a recurrent loss of voice, nervous cough, fainting spells, along with depression, social withdrawal, even suicidal ideation. At an early point in treatment, Freud made up his mind that Dora for years had actually been in love with Herr K. Dora emphatically denied that until the next to last session of her treatment. Freud treated her repeated denials as confirming rather than negating his interpretations. And he would later write, "The no uttered by a patient after a repressed thought has been presented to his conscious perception for the first time does no more than register the existence of a repression and its severity. It acts, as it were, as a gauge of the repression's strength. If this no, instead of being regarded as the expression of an impartial judgment, of which indeed the patient is incapable, is ignored, and if work is continued, the first evidence soon begins to appear that in such a case, no signifies the desired yes." Essentially, sometimes when you claim to hate something, you actually love it. Sometimes when you claim to be revolted by something, it actually turns you Dora didn't admit that she loved this guy until she'd already decided to terminate her treatment. At that point, it seemed like she just had no energy to argue anymore, and Freud would write, Dora disputed the fact no longer. But was Freud actually correct, or did Dora just finally tell him what he wanted to hear just to get him to shut the fuck up? Who knows? Well, that phenomenon in Freudian theory is now called reaction formation, a defense mechanism, where someone replaces an unwanted or anxiety-provoking impulse with its opposite, often expressed in an exaggerated or showy way. Easy example of this in action is the boy who teases a girl at school all the time. Not because he actually hates her, but because he actually has a huge crush on her. March of 1902, Freud achieves an important milestone. He's made a university professor at the University of Vienna. The title he received, Professor Extraordinarius, kind of like affiliated professor, was important for him for the prestige and recognition it brought, but there wasn't actually a salary or teaching obligations associated with it. He'd actually had support from the university for many years, but efforts to make him a professor had been blocked by political authorities who did not want to see a Jewish person in that position. But an influential patient of his, Baroness Marie Ferstel, supposedly bribed the Minister of Education with a valuable painting, and with that, Freud was in. In October of that year, Freud founds the Wednesday Psychological Society, now a group of people who meet every Wednesday at his apartment to discuss issues in psychology. And this group will soon count amongst its members some of the most influential names the world of psychology has ever seen. Freud had gotten the idea from a physician friend of his named Wilhelm Steckel, but also may have been who also may have been his patient. According to some stories, he became an advocate for psychology when Freud cured him of a sexual problem, of course. Other three original members were Alfred Adler, Max Kahane, and Rudolf Reitler, all Jewish physicians. I remember really liking Alfred Adler's view of therapy when I studied him. Adler will later found the School of Individual Psychology. He'll emphasize the importance of feelings of belonging, relationships within the family, and birth order when it comes to the roots of why we feel the way we do. He'll propose that contributing to others' social interest was how we develop a sense of worth and belonging in the family and society. He also focused on feelings of inferiority, coining the term inferiority complex, which he argued played a key role in personality development. Soon after, someone else would join the group. A Viennese musicologist named Max Graf. Max Graf was also the father of a little boy, Herbert Graf, and Herbert would become Freud's first child patient. They would actually only meet once, and Freud wouldn't analyze him. Instead, he had Max analyze his son while Freud was present in the room, and this is what they found. When Herbert was 4, he had witnessed a frightening event. At a local park with the family's maid, he had watched a cart horse pulling a heavy load collapse. Herbert became scared of going out into the street now, paranoid that a cart or horse might fall on him. Max, Herbert's father, initially attributed his son's neurosis to, quote, sexual overexcitement caused by his mother's caresses. Oh boy. Which had found a symbolic representation in the large penises of the horses he saw that day. Max even said that this led his wife to threaten their son with castration if he didn't get over his fears. What the fuck is going on in this family? Imagine being little Herbert. Poor guy, you see a cart horse collapse, feel a heavy load when you're just 4. Now you're scared of horses, makes sense. But then your dad starts telling you that what you're really scared of are the sexual lusting feelings you got for your mom, feelings represented by the side of that horse cock. And then your mom tells you that if you don't get over these feelings, she's going to cut off your balls. Not sure how well adjusted or not Herbert ended up becoming once he was an adult, but I'm pretty sure Herbert ended up pretty fucked up with these two nitwits for parents. Well, Freud disagreed with Herbert's parents, but he still made his observations sexual. Of course he did. Freud interpreted Herbert's fear of a horse falling over or collapsing as a hidden fear of his dad, fear that his dad would punish him for his desires over his mom. After Freud explained this to Herbert, he said the fears went away. But then Herbert became preoccupied with excrement, which Freud associated with the birth of babies, and indeed, Herbert's mom had just given birth to a little girl. Freud also linked this back to the fear of carts, since Herbert had been told that babies got delivered by storks, like packages. Herbert feared the cart because he feared that his mom would have more babies and he would have more rivals for her attention. Freud wrote a summary of the analytic process here in a paper in which he called Herbert Little Hans, which he published in 1909. No idea if Freud was actually correct in any of his assumptions about little Herbert. Before 1909, Freud had published some other writings. In 1905, he published 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, advancing his theories about sexuality, particularly in relation to childhood. Freud began his first essay on the sexual aberrations by distinguishing between the sexual object and the sexual aim, noting that deviations from the norm could occur with respect to both. According to Freud, the sexual aim refers to the specific act or desired action that leads to sexual satisfaction, essentially the goal of sexual desire. And he believed that this aim could be achieved through various means, depending on the individual's psychosexual development and the sexual object. the person or thing they desire, that they are focused on. Lucifina might be your sexual object. She's who you want to have sex with. Your sexual aim with Lucifina might be to have her use your balls as a speed bag while she wears 14-ounce boxing gloves, and you're suspended from a ceiling with ropes. Or you might just want to have missionary position sex with her. That could also be your sexual aim. Freud's second essay, Infantile Sexuality, argued that even young children have sexual urges, from which adult sexuality only gradually emerges via psychosexual development, which we covered already. Having covered in broad outline the transition from infantile sexuality to latency, Freud returns to the problem of how sexuality emerges from the primary activity of sucking at the breast. What about babies like me, Freud? Babies never given mama sweet teats, but only bottles. Is that why I love boobs so much, right? Is that why I love my ladies' nipples? Because I never got to suck on mamas growing up? I'm not even sure I want that question answered, actually. Freud argued that when we are infants, no differentiation exists between the hunger, the instinct of self-preservation, and libido. He wrote, "It was a child's first and most vital activity, his sucking at his mother's breast, or as substitutes for it that must have familiarized him with his pleasure. The child's lips, in our view, behave like an erotogenic zone, and no doubt stimulation by the warm flow of milk is the cause of the pleasurable sensation. The satisfaction of the erotogenic zone is associated in the first instance with the satisfaction of the need for nourishment. To begin with, sexual activity attaches itself to one of the functions serving the purpose of self-preservation and does not become independent of them until later. No one who has seen a baby sinking back satiated from the breast and falling asleep with flushed cheeks and a blissful smile can escape the reflection that this picture persists as a prototype of the expression of sexual satisfaction in later life." No one, Freud? I remember seeing my son drink up off his mom's breast and, be happy to have a full belly, not off to sleep. And I'm pretty sure I literally never once thought, little man looks like he just came. And enjoy that little sample of what's to come, buddy. Feels like old Siggy Horndog projecting a bit here. I mean, I get that the body language there could be similar, but come on. This interpretation fed into Freud's overall theme that the sex drive isn't a unique phenomenon that we find in mature adults. It's a complicated and diverse one that begins in infancy. In addition to the pleasures of the oral, anal, and phallic zones, Freud believed there was also pleasure to be found in scopophilia, pleasure derived from looking at a person or object, exhibitionism, and cruelty. And Freud believed that kids were polymorphous perverse. Their sexuality has a non-specific nature, and they can experience erotic pleasure from any part of the body. But though they know their own bodies, they don't know why things happen the way they happen, and that creates neurotic complexes. He wrote, "It is self-evident to a male child that a genital like his own is to be attributed to everyone he knows, and he cannot make its absence tally with his picture of these other people," Freud writes. Does he think that? Do little kids just think that little boys, that everyone has a dick? What Freud was saying was that he believed that most boys assumed that all people had penises, but when they saw girls' genitals, they became concerned that something had gone missing, and would then become concerned that such a thing might happen to their own sex organs. On the other hand, when girls of a tender age learned about the penis, they often thought they would like to have one, and would feel slighted that they did not. Finally, because thinking about all this would freak adults out, Freud believed that most people developed infantile amnesia, forgetting these traumatic parts of childhood. That is why you don't think you used to be devastated at the thought of not having a dick, ladies. You wanted your own dick so bad you had to repress that desire as you moved forward towards adulthood. Otherwise, you would fall so deep into a pit of dickless depression and despair, you would never be able to crawl your dickless self back out. In his third essay, The Transformations of Puberty, Freud argued that puberty is dominated by the genitals, not the various other erogenous zones that play different roles earlier in development. That's because, the genitals, they become it and stuff. That was the logic. The genitals can induce orgasm, the end goal of sexual development. All of the other erogenous zones can't give you that, so they're more likely to become sites of frustration and anxiety and later perversions. Looking at you, foot fuckers. Actually, Freud was looking at you. I don't care if you have a foot fetish. Freud stated basically that while an orgasm allows for a complete release of tension, sucking on some toes, then not progressing past that, for example, would not. It would lead to tension. Sounds like Freud was pretty worried about blue balls, or blue bean, the female equivalent. I've never heard anyone say blue bean in my life, by the way. Not that I can recall. But according to the internet, it's slang, and I like it. Freud also wrote some weird stuff about women and the transformations of puberty. Another one of his works, like the following: "The sexuality of little girls is of a wholly masculine character, and that it would even be possible to maintain that libido in invariably and necessarily of a masculine nature, whether it occurs in men or women." You hear that, ladies? When you get horny, it's kind of like you stop becoming women and you become frat boys. That same year, Freud published The Transformations of Puberty. he would also publish jokes and their relation to the unconscious. His main line of inquiry was simple. Why are jokes pleasurable? Yeah, Freud, why does it feel so good to laugh? Why have I spent the overwhelming majority of my adult life, whether through stand-up comedy, podcasting, or other mediums like reality TV, talking head shows, etc., trying to make people laugh? Freud wrote that we like jokes because there is a pleasure to be obtained from the saving of psychic energy. Dangerous feelings of hostility, aggression, cynicism, or sexuality are expressed via jokes, bypassing the internal and external censors and thus enjoyed. Freud connected his theories of joking with his dream theories in order to explain some of the more baffling aspects of joking, including how jokes seem to come from nowhere, how we usually get the joke so very quickly, even when it expresses very complicated social phenomena, and why we get a particular type of pleasure from an act of communication. Freud believed that all jokes had a hidden meaning, and that they were often a way of expressing repressed feelings or desires. He also wrote, the euphoria we wish to reach by these means, the comic, jokes, the humor, is nothing other than the mood of a period of life in which we were accustomed to deal with our psychical work in general with a small expenditure of energy, the mood of our childhood, when we were ignorant of the comic, were incapable of jokes, and when we had no need of humor to make us feel happy in our life. Basically, as we develop and experience life's trials and tribulations, our psyche attempts to outmaneuver all the pain, insecurity, and sadness of the human condition, and humor is a safe and easy way to attain this happiness on the cheap, to escape the inherent trauma of the human condition. And I gotta say, I'm not sure I really ever thought about it this way before, but that last part does make sense to me. Most comics I know, and I would include myself in this category, were Peter Pans in some sense. We don't want to grow up. We want to remain childlike in a sense. We don't want to work. We want to play. We don't want to grow old and act mature. We want to be silly, immature, escapist, live in some version of imagination land. We are, in short, big kids. And while I have long thought that we're big kids, I don't know that I ever really deeply thought about why we're big kids. And I think it's because, life fucking sucks if you think too hard about it. I mean, just the inherent nature of life. We are all marching steadily towards death. Trauma is awaiting around the corner for us all. We just don't know how far ahead it lies. If we don't die young ourselves, we will lose so many people we love. We will suffer rejection. We all suffer rejection, whether we live long or not. We all get sick. We see our bodies start to fail if we live long enough. We see the world around us change in ways we don't like oftentimes. We hurt others. We get hurt ourselves. There's a lot of fucking pain in the human condition. Inevitable pain. In fact, I would say that most of the human condition is made up of some kind of pain. So thank God for jokes as a way to deal with the pain, to escape from it. Right? To forget about our problems through comedy and also through sex. I understand now, I think, why Freud wrote about both. They are related. Sex and comedy, two of the best ways to find temporary respite from the crux of the human condition. To escape, thoughts of impending death and trauma and just fucking come or laugh. Long live coming and comedy. Hail Nimrod. Hail Lucifina. Okay, moving on now. Remember the Psychopathology of Everyday Life, the essay Freud published in 1901, the text where he would coin the term Freudian slip. Well, somebody read that, and now they wanted Freud's help. In October of 1907, either Ernst Lanzer or Paul Lorenz, it's unclear what his real name was, but it was probably Lanzer, came to Freud for help to deal with his obsessive fears. The 29-year-old's main fear was that something terrible was going to happen to his father, who was dead, and his girlfriend as well, who was alive. Okay, so this guy's really going through some strange shit. His fear had grown out of an account he had heard from a fellow army officer concerning a Chinese torture method in which a large pot containing a live rat was strapped to the buttocks of the victim. God, this is fucking torture. And the rat, encouraged by a red-hot poker, would gnaw its way out through the victim's asshole. This got worse when he lost his eyeglasses. Placed an order for a new pair to be sent through the post, Lanzer's colleague informed him that another lieutenant had paid the shipping fee for him and that he should pay him back. And after learning that, Lanzer irrationally convinced himself that he must personally pay back the lieutenant quickly, otherwise his friends and or relatives will be tortured with rats that would chew their way into their assholes and ravage their insides. I mean, which makes total sense if you just take a second to think about it. I mean, everybody knows that if somebody pays a shipping fee on your behalf and you don't pay them back in a timely fashion, well, there's a good chance they're going to kidnap somebody you love and have a rat, attack their butthole. Very common occurrence. Based on this, Freud would refer to this patient as Ratman in the case study he published in 1909. Digging deeper into Ratman's childhood, Freud discovered that Lanzer had overwhelming desires to see women naked. Is that like a rare thing? And recalled experiencing boners beginning at the age of 6. At the age of 12, he experienced a strong crush on a young girl, thought that if something bad were to happen to him, she might come up to him to express her sympathy. So he started to fantasize about his dad dying. The subconscious wish, though his conscious love for his dad suppressed it. Later on, he had a secret thought that he wished his father would die so he could inherit all of his money and become rich enough to marry before shaming himself by fantasizing that his father would die and leave him nothing. Lanzer even went so far as to fantasize about marrying Freud's daughter, believing, Freud writes, that the only reason I was so kind and incredibly patient with him was that I wanted to have him for a son-in-law. It was obvious to Freud that Lanzer's father had sexually suppressed him at some important stage of development. This was evident in the fact that Lanzer also had a strange habit of opening the door to his flat between midnight and 1 a.m., apparently so that his father's ghost could enter his place. Lanzer would then stare at his penis following letting his dad's ghost in, sometimes using a mirror. Is that supposed to be weird? Open up your front door to let ghosts in just past midnight and then stare at your dick in the mirror for a while before you go back to bed? Well, I mean, if it is, guess I'm a weirdo then. Guilty as charged. I thought everyone did that. Freud worked with this guy for several months before Lanzer felt cured enough to end the sessions, but unfortunately, Lanzer would then die in World War I. And now, his poor male descendants have to open their doors just after midnight to let him and his dad in, and then they all stare at their dicks, real and ghost, in the same mirror. I'm guessing. The following year, Freud renames the Wednesday Psychological Society to the Vienna Psychoanalytical Society. By this time, the group had grown to a membership of 16, including Carl Jung and Otto Rank, both of whom would go on to be highly influential psychoanalytic thinkers. We'll talk more about Carl Jung, a titan in the field of analytical psychology, in just a bit. Also, on April 26, 1908, Freud attends the First International Psychoanalytical Congress at the Hotel Bristol in Salzburg, Austria. There, Freud presented his case history of the Rat Man. His lecture lasted 4 hours without pause. 4 hours without pause. Almost a further hour by demand. To a rapt audience around a large table. And I thought my podcast went on forever. Freud's other short papers published that year were Creative Writers and Daydreaming, Character and Anal Erotism, Civilized Sexual Morality and Modern Nervous Illness, and Ghosts, How to Catch 'Em, How to Hold 'Em Down, and How to Fuck 'Em. No. His final short paper that year was titled On the Sexual Theories of Children. Arguably a weirder title than my ghost bullshit. In September, Freud would visit Manchester again, making a stop in Zurich on the way back home from England to see someone he had started to see socially at meetings of psychoanalysts, Carl Jung. He had met Jung, a Swiss psychiatrist, in Vienna in 1907. Some sources say 1906, and Jung turned out to be a great admirer of Freud's work. Apparently, after meeting, the two talked for 13 hours straight. Holy shit. And Freud wasn't even doing blow anymore. He had finally stopped doing blow between 1888 and 1900 after he tried to cure a friend of morphine addiction by prescribing him increasingly heavier doses of cocaine, and he got him wildly addicted to coke, did not cure him of morphine addiction, and almost killed him. Freud had also done so much blow by that point that he had to have sinus surgery so he could keep breathing through his nose thanks to his nasal passage tissue collapsing from doing so much nose candy so often. Coke. It always presents itself as your new best friend and then steadily becomes your worst enemy if you're not real careful. Back to he and Jung's mutual admiration, Freud considered Jung his protege and successor, the Joshua to my Moses, he once wrote. Another time, he referred to him as his crown prince. The two would even travel to the U.S. together in August of 1909 to give joint lectures. Freud would propose that Jung should think of their relationship as between father and son. An odd proposal in any friendship, but especially given Freud's association with fathers. Freud was 19 years older than Jung, though, so I get it on some level. That was not the only odd thing about their friendship. On September 2nd, 1909, just before leaving New York City for their lecture tour, Freud, while gazing at the Palisades across the river from the city, accidentally peed his pants. He tragically did not go peeping in the potty like a good boy, and he was worried about doing it again. He told Jung he was afraid he would wet himself during his upcoming lectures and agreed to let Jung analyze the event. But when Freud produced a telling dream about his wife and sister-in-law Minna, and Jung, who had already interpreted Freud's pants wetting as a need to draw constant attention to himself no matter what the cost, pressed Freud for more intimate details, Freud declined. He said he could not, quote, risk his authority. What was he hiding? That affair with his sister-in-law? Well, that's what Jung would think. And also the two would soon diverge in their theories now. During this time and until the publication of The Unconscious in 1923, Freud was continuing to develop his ideas about how the unconscious worked. In many ways, it would be the culmination of his work, since his treatises on dreams, jokes, Freudian slips, and childhood all maintained that it was the exploration of the unconscious that yielded the meaning behind certain behaviors. But what was the unconscious in and of itself? Here's what Freud came up with, which will also lead us into some of what Jung came up with. And I find this section very insightful, maybe my favorite. He divided the mind into the conscious mind, aka the ego, and the unconscious mind. The unconscious mind was then further divided into the id, instincts and drive, and the superego, aka the conscience, all working on a level that a person cannot perceive themselves since they're actively repressing these thoughts. Also between the conscious and unconscious mind was a layer called the preconscious, made up of thoughts that the thinker might not be fully aware of, but were not being actively suppressed either. So the process of bringing these unconscious thoughts to the surface, sort of like an elevator, contents of the unconscious mind go through the preconscious mind before coming to the floor of conscious awareness. Carl Jung agreed with Freud that the unconscious is a determinant of personality, but he proposed that the unconscious be divided into two layers, the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. The personal unconscious is a reservoir of material that was once conscious but has been forgotten or suppressed, much like Freud's notion. The collective unconscious, however, one of the things I remember finding most fascinating about Jung's work, the deepest level of the psyche, containing the accumulation of inherited psychic structures and archetypal experiences, or as Jung put it, the whole spiritual heritage of mankind's evolution, born anew in the brain structure of every individual. That's fascinating, right? What lies in the unconscious of us all? What collective experiences have not just shaped some of us, but all of us in some way? I think about this in terms of overall human behavior, right? For example, why are we all, unless we really actively work against it, so quick to see people who don't share the same overall ideological, cultural, or theological beliefs as we do, or look the same as the other? And why do we then want to demonize the other and read negative motives into what might truly be benign or even positive behavior? Essentially, why are we so quick to think, they not like me, I good, they bad? In illogical, right, in illogical and untrue ways. Probably because when you look at behavior in terms of evolutionary psychology, a branch of psychology heavily influenced by Jungian psychology, that studies how human behavior, thought, and feelings are influenced by evolutionary processes, quickly judging and fearing others has kept us alive. Right? It used to be very beneficial back in our caveman, small tribes hunting sticks or hunting shit with sharp rocks and stick stays. When we encountered someone we didn't know, someone not from our tribe, it was beneficial to assume that they did mean us harm, that they did want to take our shit, because they often did in fact want to do those things. And if we didn't assume that, our odds of being killed by this other went way up. And so the genes of our most paranoid, fearful, aggressive ancestors got passed down the most frequently, because our more trusting, empathetic ancestors ended up dying a lot more often. And for a long time, this skeptical nature worked very well for us humans. It was a very positive trait. But now it's often a hindrance that leads to irrational and harmful racism, xenophobia, homophobia, etc. Just an interesting example of an aspect of the collective unconscious. Hopefully I got that right. Refocusing on Freud and Jung again. Unlike Freud, Jung didn't believe that sexuality was at the base of all repressed thoughts. And there were other differences between them too. Jung believed that religion was an important mode of connection between people, while Freud believed it was mostly a distraction. Jung was also interested in the paranormal, where Freud was a complete skeptic. Indeed, in 1909, Jung visited Freud in Vienna to discuss Freud's view on the paranormal. Freud tried to discourage Jung from exploring anything along paranormal lines, but as they continued to talk, Jung felt a weird sensation in his stomach. Just as Jung became aware of this sensation, a loud noise erupted from a bookcase standing next to them that nobody was standing near. That no one was touching, rather. Jung claimed that it must have been of paranormal origin, this loud noise, while Freud angrily disagreed. As they continued to argue, Jung claimed that the noise happened again, which it did. He claimed that the noise would happen again. He predicted it, and then it did, and they both heard it. Very weird. What was it? We'll never know. Both men stared at each other in amazement, but never spoke about the incident further. They continued analyzing each other's dreams, though now the dreams had more anxious overtones about each other than they had before. In one instance, Jung shared a dream with Freud in which he explores a house, descends to the cellar, and then beneath the cellar finds an ancient vault containing 2 human skulls. Freud pressed Jung for his associations. Jung, sensing his dream reflected his emergent ideas of the collective unconscious and fearful of Freud's resistance, lied and said the skulls represented those of his wife, Emma, and her sister. So jealous of these intense dreams, by the way. I almost never remember dreaming. Very rare for me. According to the internet, that means I either have a sleep disorder, maybe just not getting quite enough sleep, that I'm stressed out, that I have nothing to worry about, or I'm bipolar. Yeah, thanks, internet. That's not stressful. Perhaps with his father-son relationship with Jung in mind, Freud took the opportunity to write about his now infamous Oedipus complex in 1910. Freud first proposed this concept in that book, The Interpretation of Dreams. Although he did not formally begin using the term Oedipus complex until 1910, in an article titled A Special Type of Choice of Object Made by Men. Oh, it's special, all right. Mama's so special. The term first appeared in a section of the paper describing what happens after a boy first becomes aware of prostitution. He wrote, when after this he can no longer maintain the doubt which makes his parents an exception to the universal and odious norms of sexual activity, he tells himself with cynical logic that the difference between his mother and a whore is not after all so very great, since basically they do the same thing. Wow. Shots fired, Freud. He continues by writing, the enlightening information he has received has, in fact, awakened the memory traces of the impressions and wishes of his early infancy, and these have led to reactivation in him of certain mental impulses. He begins to desire his mother herself in the sense with which he has recently become acquainted, and to hate his father anew as a rival who stands in the way of this wish. He becomes, as we say, under the dominance of the Oedipus complex. He does not forgive his mother for having granted He does not forgive his mother for having granted the favor of sexual intercourse, not to himself, but to his father, and he regards it as an act of unfaithfulness. And that really grosses me out. Would Freud think that is because I secretly really want to fuck my mom? But the thought of eating raw cow eyeballs also grosses me out. So do I secretly really want to eat those as well? Thought of sex with a man, any man, grosses me out. Do I secretly wish that my mom was a man? And I could fuck my man mom and then enjoy a post-coital snack of nothing but raw cow eyeballs? Or do I just actually not want to fuck my mom or dudes or eat cow eyes? I'm pretty sure that second one's correct. Sorry, Freud. Also in 1910, Freud started considering art from a psychological perspective. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Freud believed that sublimation of unsatisfied libido was responsible for producing all art and literature. That is, he thought that there was a third type of person to become if you had unresolved issues from your infantile sexual development. You could become a pervert, an erotic, or, new option, artist. Fuck. I do talk a lot about wieners and Lucifina. Is my entire career based mostly on me being a pervert? It might. If something happened to Lindsay, sometimes I think I would just be so depressed and a hermit for the rest of my life, just be alone for the rest of my life. Other times I think that there's a chance I could become a wildly self-destructive, hedonistic sex addict. In 1910, Freud published a paper about Leonardo da Vinci titled Leonardo da Vinci and a Memory of His Childhood, analyzing da Vinci's art as a product of his familial background. Da Vinci was an illegitimate child, and while he was still a baby, his father married another woman. Later, sometime before the age of 5, he was taken to his father's household and raised by him and his stepmom. Freud analyzed a childhood recollection recorded by Leonardo, in which he claimed that while in his cradle, a large bird opened his mouth with its tail and struck him many times with his tail against his lips. Freud assumes that this is so unlikely to have happened in reality that it's probably a fantasy, which made it ripe for interpretation. As might be expected, Freud interpreted the fantasy sexually, as being an expression of passive homosexuality, the bird's tail substituting for the penis, okay, and Leonardo's wish to put the penis in his mouth. All right, maybe. I thought maybe he was just worried about a bird taking a shit in his mouth. Because, there's a lot of birds, flying around where he's living in Italy, and, it could happen. People do have a bird shit in their mouth sometimes. That's kind of gross. Looking at Da Vinci's career, Freud suspected that Leonardo's strong attachment to his mother, combined with his illegitimate birth, led to a lifelong fascination with the feminine and a potential repression of sexual desire, which manifested in his art through the depiction of beautiful women with ambiguous expressions. The tendency for Da Vinci to leave many of his paintings incomplete was seen by Freud as a reflection of his own internal conflicts and inability to fully commit to a single course of action. Couldn't just be that he was just good at a lot of stuff and got distracted easily because of, ADHD or some shit. Since we'll never obviously get to talk to Da Vinci about this, we'll never know if Freud was on to anything. Still in 1910, Freud also dealt with a patient that was actually around for him to interview, a case that would become known as the Wolf Man. From around the age of 4, this patient was terrified of a recurrent dream he had in which 6 or 7 white wolves sat on the branches of a walnut tree which stood outside his bedroom window. Freud concluded from this dream that the Wolfman had seen his parents fuck doggy style when he was an infant, and that terrified him, even though the patient had no memories of that happening. And I'm going to say, get the fuck out of here. That's a huge stretch. So you keep having this dream where there are 6 or 7 wolves on a tree branch outside your bedroom window, and they scare you, right? Yes, Dr. Freud. Well, your problem is obvious. When you were a little baby, your dad bent your mother over, really stuck it to her from behind. Next patient. Freud was insightful in moments, very insightful, but also so fucking weird. With Wolfman, before finishing his treatment, Freud asked him to give Freud a present so that, quote, the feeling of gratitude wouldn't become too strong. And then the Wolfman just, awkwardly, obligingly gave Freud an Egyptian statuette. That is bizarre. You're really going to feel grateful for everything I've done for you. So grateful. It might fuck you up. So how about you give me something cool so you can feel like less indebted to me and stuff. Let's return now to the relationship between Freud and Jung. On October 15th, 1911, Emma Jung, Carl Jung's wife, wrote to a mutual friend to inquire whether he was aware of Freud's disapproval of her husband's latest work. In her letter, she explicitly asked the friend not to mention her concerns to Freud. On October 19th, the friend, betraying Emma's confidence, enclosed her letter in his correspondence to Freud. The friend also speculated that if Freud was upset with Jung, it might be because of Jung's interest in the occult, which Freud thought was silly and stupid, and their diverging perspectives on the influence of the libido. Freud's answer to the letter spelled out the manner in which he should respond to Mrs. Jung. He asked the friend not to mention the topics of the occult and libido, but because the words meaning strike, as in to avoid, and emphasize are similar in German, the friend misread Freud's instructions and conveyed to Emma Jung that Freud was particularly troubled by Jung's current interests. This in turn led to Emma writing to Freud herself, and when Jung found evidence of the correspondence, a heavy mistrust began to form between him and his old mentor. Why was his wife talking about him to that pervert Freud behind his back? Freud and Jung managed to reconcile later that year, briefly, around November of 1912. But then shortly afterwards, Freud fainted for the second time in Jung's presence. Jung then tenderly carried Freud to his sofa. Fucking strong in mind and body, Jung. He carried him to the sofa. 2 days later, he wrote him a friendly note apologizing for earlier difficulties and inquiring after Freud's health. Freud's response to Jung acknowledged some outstanding differences in their theoretical views, and then, referring to his fainting spell, he wrote, "According to my private diagnosis, it was migraine. Not without a psychic factor, which unfortunately I haven't had time to track down. A bit of neurosis I ought to look into." However, Freud was much more candid in a letter to Ernest Jones, when he attributed his fainting spell in front of Jung to a, quote, unruly homosexual feeling, which involved a transference from his earlier and intense friendship with another doctor to Jung now. Apparently, Jung sensed that Freud was downplaying the cause of the fainting spell and became furious, possibly because earlier in their relationship, he had confessed to Freud that he had been sexually assaulted as a boy by a man he trusted. He also admitted when he asked Freud for his photograph that he had a, quote, religious crush on Freud, which he was aware had clear erotic undertones. And these two fuckers just could not turn off their analytical minds, it seemed, at least to me, and overanalyze the shit out of life sometimes. Was it all that? I don't know. To quote my daughter Monroe, it's not always that deep. Feels like these guys frequently searched too deeply for answers. Or maybe they just had way more going on than I seem to have in my brain. After 2 weeks of exchanging angry letters with Jung, Freud decided to pull the trigger, and on January 3rd, 1913, Freud basically broke up with Carl. "I shall lose nothing by it," he wrote in a letter, "for my only emotional tie with you has been a long, thin thread, the lingering effect of past disappointments, and you have everything to gain. In view of the remark you recently made to the effect that an intimate relationship with a man inhibited your scientific freedom." Looks like somebody got their feelings pretty hurt. Also looks like these two were a couple of drama queens. That same year, 1913, Freud also published Totem and Taboo, his first serious work on early civilization. Freud, following Darwin, supposed that primitive man lived in small groups or hordes dominated by a single powerful male, who not only kept all the females for himself, but also expelled his younger male rivals, thus preventing incest and encouraging the formation of sexual ties outside the original group. Freud went on to suggest that, quote, "One day the brothers who had been driven out came together, killed and devoured their father, and so made an end of their patriarchal horde. The totem meal, devouring of a sacred object, like Catholics taking communion, which is perhaps man's earliest festival, would thus be a repetition of this memorable and criminal deed, which was the beginning of so many things, of social organization, of moral restrictions, and of religion." This was not a metaphor. Freud actually believed this happened. He believed that if you trace Christian communion back far enough, it goes back to a time when we used to eat our dads. Okay. Freud then asserted that the sons who had slaughtered their father became afflicted with such guilt that they banned eating the totem in most cases, so the special times when they did consume it became the return of the repressed. Today, Totem and Taboo is considered part of the early 20th century trend of armchair anthropology. Even Freud himself later said regarding this particular book, "Oh, don't take that one seriously. I made that up on a rainy Sunday afternoon." That's a quote of his. That's pretty funny. Don't make too much of my observations in that book. That book's shit. I was fucking around. I was bored. The following year, Freud would return more seriously to psychology in 1914. He'd publish his pivotal paper on narcissism, an introduction. Freud originally used the term narcissist to describe a sexual perversion in which the subject is in love with himself rather than with another person. It was later extended to include any form of self-love. Since self-esteem is necessary to psychic health, Freud argued that some degree of narcissism should be considered normal. Freud thought that everyone directed libido both towards the self, ego libido, and towards others, object libido. When a person is in love, the greater part of his libido is invested in his beloved. But when a person is ill, either physically or mentally, he becomes more self-absorbed and less capable of emotional involvement with others. Okay, interesting. Freud speculated that extreme forms of narcissism are exhibited in a type of schizophrenia, in which everything that happens in the world is interpreted by the sufferer as referring to themselves. This also had a big effect for what we might call the Freud cinematic universe, or how Freud developed his ideas about all the parts of the psyche working in tandem over the course of his entire career. Before, he had assumed that people had two sets of instincts: self-preservative instincts, which pertain to the ego, and sexual instincts, which pertain to objects. Now he concluded that self-preservation and self-love were really the same thing, and that what mattered was the degree to which libido was directed towards objects as compared with the degree to which it was directed towards the self. Unfortunately, this played right into the hands of Freud's critics, who had long accused him of relating fucking everything to sex. By affirming that love of others was self-love turned outward, Freud appeared to be stating that sexual impulses were indeed the sole source of psychic energy. Sex, sex, sex. Are we really guided almost entirely by it in some way? I mean, it is what keeps our species around. It would make sense for it to be our strongest biological imperative. 1914, World War I breaks out that summer, after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria. As an Austrian, the cause of the war was near to Freud's heart, and he was initially very patriotic. Two of his sons, Ernst and Martin, volunteered for duty in the Austrian army, sent Freud frequent updates. By October, Martin had fallen seriously ill, and Freud and Martha sent their son money to see a doctor and buy food. In a heartfelt letter, Martin would explain to his father that he had gotten a few days off and checked into a hotel to find some comfort, as he had already lost 9 pounds, and his commander suspected he was suffering from jaundice. Also confessed to his parents that he had doubts about military service, writing, "The last couple of days proved to me that being in possession of money is an invaluable advantage. It is strange, but lately, in account of fever and being unwell, my military ambitions diminished, giving room to occupational and family interests." By January of 1915, Martin was sent back to military school in Salzburg, where he was trained to be a corporal. Both of Freud's sons would survive the war, but the war would not go well for Austria. The constitutional situation in Austria-Hungary, with 2 separate states joined under one single monarch, led to problems funding the army. The same man, Francis Joseph I, was Emperor of Austria, and he was King of Hungary. He was also part of royal leadership of numerous other states and principalities across Europe. He was the Grand Duke of Tuscany, the Grand Prince of Transylvania, the Duke of Parma, Auschwitz, about 8 other places, the Prince of Trento and Brixen, and fucking on and on and on. He was spread way too thin. And one result of that was that money was always short for the Austrians, with the result that each year the full complement of new conscripts could not be recruited. The newest weapons were introduced slowly and piecemeal. Training weapons and rounds were always in short supply, and officers' low pay kept it from being a serious career path for most middle-class educated sons. Also, like most contemporary armies, Austrian tactical doctrine in 1914 held that the assault, military offensives in general, was the only path to victory. High casualties were to be expected and accepted, but could be mitigated by a high offensive spirit on the part of the assaulting troops. And that doctrine wasn't wrong so much as it was poorly suited for a long war. Facing off against 3 fronts, Russia, Serbia, and Italy, Austria found itself losing too many men too quickly. In 1918, Austrian Emperor Karl attempted to save the situation by sending a peace note on September 18th, but it came too late. The Allies rejected it and declared their intention, which U.S. President Woodrow Wilson had publicly supported, of liberating all Slavic peoples from German and Austro-Hungarian rule. The empire that Sigmund Freud had lived in all his life was going to be dismantled. In 1920, the Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye would finish the job of doing that. This lesser talked about than the Treaty of Versailles that crushed Germany, like the Treaty of Versailles, effectively saddled the blame of the Great War on the Central Powers: Germany, Austro-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. The newly formed Republic of Austria would now be forced to recognize the newly independent states of Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, and the Kingdom of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs. Might be Croats. No, I think it's Croats. Also, at the end of the war, Freud's son Martin was taken prisoner by the Italian army, put in a detention camp in Genoa, from which he would not be released until August of 1919. And all of that had a profound effect on Freud's writings. In 1915, he first started thinking seriously about hate, writing a paper called Instincts and Their Vicissitudes. It was Freud's first recognition of an aggressive instinct as a constituent of the ego, distinct from the sexual instinct. Before this period, Freud had regarded aggression as constituting a sadistic aspect of the sexual instinct, as an urge for mastery, a primitive form of striving for and dominating the sexual object. But he was still working out how the destructive instinct worked. Then, after interviewing shell-shocked soldiers in 1919, death and violence became more prominent in his theories, and he emphasized the ways participation in mass society released deep-seated aggressive impulses. Social crises, he argued, allowed us to see aspects of human nature normally hidden in everyday life. Freud's first full acknowledgement of an aggressive instinct appeared in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, a speculative paper first published in 1920. In that paper, he introduced the idea that the human psyche was subject to two conflicting drives, the life drive, or the libido, and the death drive. The death drive was expressed through aggression, self-destructiveness, and repetition. When Freud had worked with soldiers with war trauma, he observed that subjects often tended to repeat or reenact these traumatic experiences. Dreams occurring in traumatic patients have the characteristic of repeatedly bringing the patient back into the situation of his accident, he wrote, contradicting what he had previously thought about human behavior, that it was all trying to reach a blissful point of stasis. He argued that repetition was the body trying to restore itself to an earlier state, i.e. the past, that harkened back to the state before the body was even alive, aka some part of the human mind longed for death. Or, as Freud wrote, it seems then that an instinct is an urge inherent in organic life to restore an earlier stage of things which the living entity has been obliged to abandon under the pressure of external disturbing forces. Freud considered that aggression was derived from the death instinct being redirected towards the external world. He wrote, "The instinct of destruction, moderated and tamed, and as it were, inhibited in its aim, must, when it is directed towards objects, provide the ego with the satisfaction of its vital needs and with control over nature. This aggression is directed first against unwanted stimuli from the external world, second as sadism, subserving the domination of sexual objects, and third against individuals or circumstances which frustrate the desires of the ego. However, because civilization ensures that part of this destructiveness is again turned inward, incorporated into the superego, and manifested as a sense of guilt giving rise to self-reproach, self-hatred, and self-punishment, civilization, therefore, obtains mastery over the individual's dangerous desire for aggression by weakening and disarming it, and by setting up an agency within him to watch over it, like a garrison in a conquered city." Freud goes on to conclude that the inclination towards aggression constitutes the greatest impediment to civilization. Very wordy, but pretty fascinating stuff. Right? We are these primitive creatures that for so much of human evolution have been mostly focused on hunting, fucking, and fighting. But now we're trying to wear suits, go to work in offices, follow tons of laws, invest for our retirements, perform well in jobs so new to our species like being a podcaster, what even is this? Raise our kids to have empathy and understanding. It's all very unnatural considering our history. Now we're trying to shut down or at least suppress so many of the instincts and drives which have helped us stay alive and thrive for the majority of our history. And that suppression, it fucks us up in psychological ways we're still trying to understand. I mean, do you ever think about how weird modern life is? That we're still essentially monkeys, better equipped in some ways to living and fucking in the woods and killing or growing our own food and never interacting with tiny computer screens or trying to figure out complex tax codes. That we're not built for life to keep evolving and changing as quickly as it now does thanks to the exponential advances in technology. That a lot of our angst, confusion, depression, anxiety, etc. in our modern lives is due partly or even mainly to the fact that this is all so new still. We're still trying to get our heads around it. That we're not really settled in and fully acclimated to modern life yet. Back to Freud in 1923, he would publish his writings about the ego, id, and superego. And then in 1927's The Future of an Illusion, Freud would dive deeper into what we believe, why we believe it, and argue that the primary function of religious belief is psychological consolation. He claimed that the belief in a supernatural protector serves as a buffer against man's, quote, fear of nature, just as the belief in an afterlife serves as a buffer against man's intense fear of death. Essentially, God did not create us in his image, we created God in our image. And that really resonated with me when I first read about it back when I was in college. And while I know probably most of you do not feel the same, I believe it today, that most of our gods over the course of human history have behaved a lot like we do, very human ways, because we created them in the same way I created Nimrod and Lucifina. I have changed in the sense that I do believe in a creative higher power. I've become a lot more spiritual, but I still also think that the gods of organized religion have been manufactured by us to give ourselves comfort and a sense of order in a universe of chaos and the unknown, and to help us, overcome our fear of death. Pretty dark to some to think this, but comforting to me. Speaking of dark, besides the loss of World War I and the end of the Austrian Empire, there were other reasons that Freud was in a dark place in the 1920s. In 1920, his daughter Sophie died from the flu. A virus eviscerated an already war-damaged Europe, right? Remember this big Spanish flu pandemic still going on? She was only 27 when she passed. She was also pregnant and a mother of two, so tragic. 3 years later, Freud would also lose Sophie's son, Heinerle, his grandson at the age of 4. Little Henry. And the loss of this child really hurt him. He wrote in a letter, "I have hardly ever loved a human being, certainly never a child, so much as him." Also in 1923, he discovered a precancerous growth in his jaw, certainly caused by his regular and liberal consumption of cigars, which he'd been smoking profusely for decades now. He nonetheless found himself unable or unwilling to give them up. He likened his addiction to them to his obsessional collecting of antiquities. The growth later turned into full-blown cancer, and over the rest of his life, Freud would have more than 30 surgeries to address it. And on top of all that, there was the terrifying and rising tide of anti-Semitism in Europe. Destruction and chaos in the wake of World War I led, of course, to a wish for someone to blame for those who lost the war, and the Jews have been the preferred scapegoat of the Western world since before the Roman Empire even embraced Christianity. They've always been the other in Europe, as I've talked about before, always the cultural outsider. Despite this, Freud's star was rising higher than ever. By 1925, Freud's fame had spread so widely that Polish-born U.S. movie pioneer and producer Samuel Goldwyn offered the Viennese psychoanalyst, whom he called the greatest love specialist in the world, $100,000 to write or consult on a film script about the great love stories of history. In spite of that giant offer, it would equate to almost $2 million today. Now, 69-year-old Freud turned it down, as he'd also turned down a $25,000 offer the year before from the publisher of the Chicago Tribune to psychoanalyze the famed criminals Leopold and Loeb, previous Suck subjects, as they awaited their sensationalist murder trial. He preferred to remain entirely focused on his own intellectual pursuits. 4 years later, in 1929, Freud wrote one of his most famous tracts, Civilization and Its Discontents, which would be published in 1930. The book explored what Freud saw as a clash between the desire for individuality and the expectations of society. He starts by discussing the pleasure principle, the instinctive tendency we all possess to seek pleasure and avoid pain. However, our pursuit of pleasure so often hindered by fucking reality and the demands of societal living. Stupid fucking bills and laws and kids. As such, we adopt reluctantly, in many cases, the reality principle, which obliges us to delay immediate gratification for long-term well-being, a cornerstone of civilization. But how are the pleasure principle and the reality principle supposed to exist alongside each other? Yeah, Freud. How am I supposed to accept that I can't just live the life of hedonistic devotion to Lucifina and instead read about people fucking instead of doing it? But seriously, how do you suppress some of your more unruly desires? Like sex whenever and however you want it, and the use of violence for selfish means, like punching your annoying neighbor unconscious and stuffing them in their own fucking trash can instead of asking them to turn the backyard stereo down at night. Knowing that suppressing these urges, if for the greater good, but also knowing, or is for the greater good, but also knowing that it's probably not letting you be as happy as you would be if you just leaned into your id. Freud's answer was that we walk around every day with unresolved feelings of guilt. Only this guilt is deep within our subconscious, so we experience it as anxiety or ambiguous discontent, right? Because of this disconnect between the pleasure principle and the reality principle, and I feel that one in my bones. Complicating this tension, according to Freud, is the fact that human beings need civilization in order to avoid living in a chaotic world and to maintain some personal security, right? Civilization is not just a means to stop people from murdering and raping each other, but something that actively gives us stability. But that stability comes at a cost, all these fucking rules. In the end, the book lands on a fundamental paradox. Civilization is a tool we have created to protect ourselves from unhappiness. And yet, it is also our largest source of unhappiness. It's kind of a bleak book, but I agree with Freud. Right? Civilization is the best, way better than worrying about wolves not having AC and lotion and medicine and nacho cheese Doritos and, I don't know, fucking Greek yogurt with tasty-ass granola sprinkled on top of some honey, lingerie, movie theaters, great mattresses, sheets with high thread counts, LSD, so much music on Spotify, etc., times a billion. But also, we have to work so much to dream of ever not working someday and actually spending most of our time enjoying all these modern comforts. Right? Sucks. Civilization and Its Discontent is not really a psychological text as much as it's a philosophical text on human nature. Meanwhile, the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany means more and more people are getting increasingly anxious, especially Jewish intellectuals. One of them is Albert Einstein. You've probably heard of him. 1913, Einstein initiated an exchange of letters with Freud concerning the subject of upcoming war, how it might be avoided. Einstein and Freud had met several years earlier in Berlin, were very interested in one another's work. Only a year after that exchange, in 1933, Hitler is elected Chancellor of the German Reich. 3 years earlier, in 1930, Freud has been awarded the Goethe Prize for his contributions to psychology and German literary culture. But in January of 1933, the newly empowered Nazis seized Freud's books, amongst many other psychoanalytic and Jewish authored works, and publicly burned them in big piles in Berlin. Fun times. The Nazis described this destruction as acting, quote, against the soul-destroying glorification of the instinctual life for the nobility of the human soul. Freud responded to this book burning pretty wittily and sarcastically. He said, "What progress we are making. In the Middle Ages, they would have burned me. Now they are content with burning my books." Little did he know that they would be willing to burn him very soon. At this time, Freud was completely absorbed in his new project, a book he called Moses and Monotheism. It would be a retelling of the creation of monotheism the way Freud saw it, and it would be his last major book. It's really complicated to get into, but essentially, Freud repeats what he said in Totem and Taboo about the original sin of killing the father figure, in this case Moses, and argues that the Jews became devout to compensate for their murder of Moses, an Egyptian who had led them out of Egypt during a period of civil war. After Moses died, most of the religion was abandoned, but the remaining stragglers eventually came into contact with the group who had also escaped Egypt's civil war. This group practiced the worship of a mountain god called Yahweh, and then the old gods of Moses and Yahweh were combined to form one monotheistic god figure. Meanwhile, in 1933, two of Freud's sons, Oliver and Ernst, decided it was time to leave Berlin, where they'd established careers and settled their families, and Oliver relocated to France and Ernst to England. They both wanted their dad to join them, but Sigmund remained rooted in Vienna. The only thing I can say, Freud wrote to a nephew named Sam in July of 1933, is that we are determined to stick it out here to the last. Perhaps it may not come out too bad. Freud's cancer returned in 1936. He remained in continual pain from the disease, also due to a oral prosthesis, sort of a elaborate denture he wore due to a large part of his jaw having been surgically removed by this point. But still, he stayed in Vienna. He was determined not to panic. But then in March of 1938, things got worse. Freud's home and publishing house were searched, ransacked, his passport confiscated. John Cooper Wiley, an American diplomat in Vienna, cabled, "Fear Freud, despite age and illness, is in danger." March 22nd, 1938, Anna at Gestapo. Sigmund Freud wrote those words in his diary as he waited anxiously in his Vienna home. His daughter, Anna, had been arrested that morning, the morning of March 22nd, 1938, and taken to Gestapo headquarters. She carried with her a lethal dosage of Veronal. It had been given to her secretly by her father's physician, Max Schur, as an optional way for her to bounce the fuck out if she was tortured. She was released later in the day, but her arrest added urgency to a decision Freud had reluctantly made only days earlier. His family would try to leave Vienna. But had they waited too long? Freud had decided to go to England as he knew he would have considerable diplomatic help in doing so. He was one of the most internationally famous Austrians alive, but would that be enough? Luckily it was. June 4th, 1939, Freud was accompanied by his wife, Martha, his daughter, Anna, his housekeeper, Paula Fitchel, and a young physician, Josephine Strauss, who monitored his health. Strauss was included at the last minute when Schur, Freud's usual doctor, developed appendicitis. His son Martin, his daughter Matilda, his brother Alexander, and his sister-in-law Minna had already left. Along with Anna, his wife, and Minna, Freud settled in London in a house at 20 Maresfield Gardens, where Freud continued to write and treat patients despite the painful advancement of his jaw cancer and despite Nazi aggression back in Austria and elsewhere. During this time, he was visited by famed Spanish surrealist Salvador Dali, passionate devotee, his fellow Viennese writer Stefan Zweig, and English authors Virginia and Leonard Woolf, visited by H.G. Wells, among many others. Nearly a month later, family and friends celebrated what would be his last birthday, Freud's 83rd, at his home in Hampstead at 20 Maresfield Gardens. Captured in a home movie, the gathering looks remarkably carefree, not far from the minds of those who attended. However, it was a war that seemed increasingly inevitable in family members who were absent. Among those not present were 4 of Freud's sisters. 4 months after Freud's birthday, the war began, September 1st, 1939. By this point, the progression of Freud's cancer was causing him severe pain, had by this point been declared inoperable. So he asked his doctor and friend Max Schur to euthanize him with a high dose of morphine, which the doctor did. 3 weeks later, September 23rd, Freud's body was then cremated at Golders Green Crematorium and Mausoleum, the first crematorium to be opened in London. His ashes remain there today in North London, along with the ashes of his wife Martha, who would die in 1951 at the age of 90, all 3 of his son's ashes, 2 of his daughter's ashes, including Anna's, and the ashes of various grandchildren, in-laws, other relatives, and even some family friends, all are resting in what is now called Freud Corner. Freud died not knowing if his sisters, who hadn't been able to obtain exit visas, would survive. They wouldn't. All 4 elderly women would be murdered in concentration camps. The family would not learn of their deaths until after the war had ended in early 1946. And with that, let's now get out of this timeline.
Good job, soldier. You made it back. Barely.
And now, real quick, before I recap, another interruption. I know I said we were done with the in-show sponsors, but an old sponsor, I did feel like it was kind of perfect for this topic. They reached out. I'm glad they're just not Bob and his bonsai tree bullshit. He is MIA this week. But Captain Whiskerhorn is back, baby. Howdy, partners and ponies. Here's your good buddy Tom Anderson, a.k.a. Captain Whiskerhorn. Your old pony play buddy and overall kink king. The man providing the highest quality sexy bits, bridles, harnesses, halters, hooves, gimp masks, anal plug tails, dildos, lubes, corsets, paddles, straps, vibrators, and more for the Quad State area and beyond for the past 23 years now. And right now we're having ourselves a strap on sale. In honor of kinky old Freud's sexual speculations, use code PENISENVY to get 40% off all pegging supplies. Strap on the cock you always wanted. Fuck your daddy like he was your daddy. Also use code Oedipus for 30% off all paddles. Get a spanking from whoever you want to call your mommy. And then get yourself some nipple suction clips to try and get out mommy's sweet, sweet teat milk. Feel no shame in the role-playing game and keep it in the virtual family in honor of the father of all mommy and daddy king, Sigmund Freud himself. Let us help you get full of boner, the gift that keeps on giving. And now we sell little blue pills so you can keep giving and going even after coming. No reason to stop going when you're done coming. Not when you're so full of boner. There's only room for one role-play store in this Captain Whiskerhorn's Pony Play Emporium tax shop and salary. Hi-oh, sarsaparilla, away! All right. So good to hear from Tom Anderson. God, I hope he's been taking great care of sarsaparilla. I hear she's a mighty fine mare. Okay, now Sigmund Freud. Do you feel like you know more about how the human mind works, or do you just feel a little dirtier? A little more prone to seeing dicks and pussies everywhere. But mostly dicks, since that's what women also wish they had, especially baby dicks. I don't know. Despite his more wackadoodle tendencies, Freud really did help establish some of the main psychological principles that we do take for granted today. Today, we might think it's obvious that a child's intimate relationship with each parent, including physical closeness, is likely to affect its future capacity for making warm, affectionate relationships with his peers or her peers when they grow up. Though we might not agree with everything Freud has to say about childhood, this general line of thinking really was revolutionary. In the end, Freud's theories found less resonance in medical practice and more in culture and art and literature. Freud's concept of the unconscious, his use of free association, his rediscovery of the importance of dreams encouraged painters, sculptors, and writers to experiment with the fortuitous and the irrational, to pay serious attention to their inner worlds of dream and daydream, and to find significance in thoughts and images which they would previously have dismissed as absurd or illogical. If you like surrealist movies like Mulholland Drive or Videodrome, or pretty much any horror, since most of it has to do with the subconscious in some way, well, that's thanks, in large part, to Freud. His major contributions include the concepts of the unconscious mind that emerges in dreams, jokes, and art, and the importance of childhood experiences in shaping later personality. Later in life, his work would get more philosophical, exploring the complexities of human behavior, sexuality, and the tension between individual desires and societal norms across historical time periods. While we're probably grateful that our therapists are most likely not Freudians now, most therapists tend to tailor their approaches to meet individual needs, drawing from a variety of theoretical backgrounds and disciplines. Freud's theories probably do resonate with us, at least on some level. How many of us have felt the tension between our individual desires and what society wants from us? How do you balance work, hobbies, family, etc.? I mean, the whole work-life balance so many of us talk about and think about so often now. That's what Freud talked about when he spoke of balancing the pleasure principle with the reality principle. And I could go on, but I already have throughout this episode. I don't know about you, but thinking about Freud really makes me think about thinking, about the human condition, about why we do what we do, and I love that. I hope this has sparked so many reflective thoughts in you. Self-reflection, so good for those of us who are genuinely and intensely curious and who want to live an authentic, examined life. And now let's head to today's top 5 takeaways.
Timesuck Top 5 Takeaways.
Number 1, Sigmund Freud was a hugely influential psychologist. Some call him the father of psychology, working during Vienna's Jewish Renaissance, who gave us so many of the terms we know today, from sibling rivalry to ego and superego and id. Number 2, Freud's most well-known theory, and perhaps his most important, was the idea of infantile sexuality, the theory that children develop sexual and thus emotional relationships with things as early as infancy. Separated into 5 distinct phases, the overall goal of development is to become an adult who can discharge all of one's tension via orgasm with a committed and willing partner. But you can also get hung up on any of these phases and develop neuroses that follow you into adulthood. Number 3, my God, was Freud obsessed with sex? This is the main criticism that's leveled at him. Nearly all of his theories revolve around sex, and even he seemed to realize it when he discovered that there was a human impulse to do stuff that was bad for you, to repeat negative experience that could not be explained by Freud's theories that all of human behavior was oriented towards pleasure. But perhaps Freud's fixation on sex had to do less with human nature and more with Freud himself. He developed sexual attachments to a wide variety of people, from the mother of the first crush to his wife to his sister-in-law to even his psychology friend-turned-rival, the great Carl Jung. Number 4, Freud's life was marked by persistent anti-Semitism. In some ways, it was what drove him to science, to uncovering how all human behavior had common links, how we're all basically the same meat sacks. He would insist on remaining in Vienna until the 11th hour, until it became clear that the Nazis were here and that the Freuds were in trouble, before fleeing to England, though he died just a year later. But at least he died due to the cancer he brought on himself, not as a result of Nazis bringing death to him. Number 5, new info. Let's talk about his daughter, Anna Freud, a bit more. Inspired by her father, who let her sit in on his Wednesday meetings when she was a kid with other psychoanalysts, she became a noted psychologist in her own right. Some consider her to actually be one of the founders of child psychology. She developed methods for working with young patients, emphasizing the importance of understanding their developmental stages and how they use defense mechanisms to protect themselves. She also expanded upon her father's theories, though not as sexually, by focusing on the ego's role in personality and behavior. Her work helped to establish ego psychology as a distinct field, emphasizing the functions of the ego and mediating between the id, superego, and reality. In 1952, she established Hampstead Child Therapy Course and Clinic in London, which became a premier center for training child psychoanalysts and conducting research on child development and therapy. And then she died October 9th, 1982, at the age of 86.
Timesuck Top 5 Takeaways.
Sigmund Freud, the sex-crazed father of psychoanalysis, has been sucked. Thank you to the Bad Magic Productions team for all the help in making Timesuck, starting with Queen of Bad Magic, Lindsay Cummins. Thanks also to Logan Keith, helping to publish this episode and designing merch for the store at badmagicproductions.com. Thank you to Sophie Evans this week for her killer initial research. She did a great job of condensing and summarizing a lot of fascinating work of Freud. Also, huge thanks to the All Seeing Eyes moderating the Cult of the Curious private Facebook page. They have been getting bombarded with negativity since the week of the presidential election, actually since before that. And I just want to remind anyone in the Cult of the Curious private Facebook group that these people are volunteering to keep that going. I don't have the time, and I never will. It takes all my time each week to make content and handle other behind-the-scenes, business and just to have a life outside of work. They are not blocking people's posts to be assholes or to play favorites. They block or remove posts to keep the Cult of the Curious Facebook group from becoming just another fucking shithole on the internet. Just as shitty as most comment sections on the web where people just mindlessly attack one another. Just go full keyboard warrior. So, if you want to post nonstop inflammatory memes and other shit, damn well is going to piss people off. Do it somewhere else. The Cult of the Curious is not the place for that. It's a place where a lot of listeners are trying to find some escape from that shit. So thank you again to the mods who work so hard just to keep the core online community going, and they don't need to be harassed for doing so. And now time for this week's updates, which will start with an example of why we got to keep places like the Cult of the Curious, the private Facebook group, from just devolving as becoming, anarchist fucking shitholes. This first update is going to illustrate why the Facebook groups can be such amazing places for people.
Updates? Get your time sucker updates.
Yeah, starting off with an update that is both so sad and so beautiful. Sent in by super sucker Sean Carter, who is also so sad, but so grateful. Sean writes, "Hi, Suckmaster and crew. My name is Sean Carter, and I've been listening since 2020. I've listened to every episode at least a dozen times. So it's comedian. Man, thanks. Solo construction work and life. It has become a big part of my life, and I tell anyone and everyone about our cult, and there's probably an episode out there for them. I wanted to write in today to brag about our Facebook Cult of the Curious 3 out of 5 stars page. My brother passed away on 11/16/2024, succumbing to his drug addiction. Fentanyl finally found him. I was the one who had to tell our mother, and that was the worst phone call I've ever had to make. I have never heard a human scream like that, and it shattered my world hearing my mother's pain. I've tried for years to get him clean, and it was always a losing battle, living with loss and grief for someone that is still alive for years. I had went on our group asking for some emotional support. I am in shock from the absolute best people coming out for me and showing me love during this very difficult time. I'm so proud of the environment of great meat sacks that had my back with kind words, episode inside jokes and quotes, and genuine concern for a complete stranger. Dan, I'm so proud of what you created, even allowing this to take place. You're always stuck to your principles, to love people, to do what's right, no matter what it costs, no matter if it costs you listeners, as you've said before, it has. I feel we have the best fans out there of any podcast. The outpouring of genuine love and support has helped me tremendously get through this dark time. So thank you, Dan, Lindsay, Bad Magic Productions, and thank you to all the time suckers out there. You have made a difference to a stranger in ways you'll never know. I have no idea if this will reach you or let alone be read on the air, but if I could give a shout out to my brother, Brian Allen Castellanos, may he find the peace amongst Nimrod that he could not find in life. Thank you, Suckmaster, for everything. There are unseen people that rely on this show and the community it has made, Sean Carter. Damn, Sean. I mean, first and foremost, rest in peace to your brother, Brian Allen Castellanos. So sorry that the fentanyl found him. Despite the failure of drug decriminalization in places like Portland, Oregon, I still support full decriminalization of recreational drug use nationwide, plus free government fund, I'm having a terrible time talking today, plus free government-funded drug testing. If we're not going to go with, full legalization in order to help prevent tragedies exactly like this one. Coke got him addicted, but fentanyl, stomped into the coke by dealers and suppliers who care more about profit than human life, is what got him killed. And also this is why we need to keep being kind to one another in the Facebook group and all of them. The rest of the internet is there to bring everybody down. Let our groups try and bring people up. So yeah, huge thank you again to the Cult of the Curious All-Seeing Eyes, the moderators, right? This is the kind of love you bring to people, the important sense of community. I just toss out this content. I just give my take on events, try not to be a dirtbag. All of you make this a community. So sorry for your loss, Sean. May this community continue to help you grieve, give you some solace. Love you, dude. And may Brian be getting smothered in Lucifina's love and lust in a better world than this one right now. And now, Matthias, a Norwegian hoingy boingy, beautiful bastard, oofta sucker, shares some fascinating information from one of the world's most progressive countries, a nation killing it right now when it comes to the average standard of living for the common citizen, and in a lot of ways. I'm becoming a bigger and bigger fan of Norway the more I learn about it, actually. But anyway, Matthias writes, "Hello, Dan, you beautiful bastard. I'd like to share some info on what the Norwegian Directorate of Health, our socialist and definitely not underfunded version of the Department of Health, is doing to hopefully prevent people who are at risk of committing sexual abuse against children from doing so. The Directorate of Health has for a couple of years been running advertisements targeted to pedophiles on national TV, bus stops, YouTube, and as of recently, the Timesuck podcast. I don't know if that says more about me or you, but I'm sure there is no need for me to worry as these ads are blindly targeted towards males between the ages of 18 and 35, right? All joking aside, these ads are quite prevalent for a reason. The Directorate states that roughly 110,000 of my Norwegian brothers and sisters have the hots for children, a number made scarier by the fact that Norway has a population of 5.3 million. I guess so many deviants shouldn't come as a surprise considering it's the same nation that spawned Bel Gunnis, but I gotta admit that oofda, this doesn't look good. The goal of this ad campaign is to spread awareness of a low-threshold service called There Is Help. There Is Help is for adults with a sexual interest in children who have a self-identified risk and who are seeking help to never act on their sexual interest. The service cannot be offered to people who have been currently convicted of a sexual offense or to anyone currently under police investigation for a sexual offense. By going to their website, you can live chat with a therapist or sign up for treatment in the form of individualized therapy sessions with a clinical psychologist or psychiatrist. I'm a big supporter of the carrot and the stick approach when it comes to dealing with pedophilia. I want to normalize talking about pedophilia the same way I want to normalize talking about any other mental illness. Being mentally ill and committing a crime are two different things. I want to live in a country where you shouldn't be afraid to seek help from your doctor or talk to your closest relatives about your struggles so that you can get the help you need before you hurt others. That's why I support advertisements and services like There Is Help, even though it makes me uncomfortable seeing them. In addition to this, some Norwegian police departments are, in collaboration with therapists, experimenting with shock therapy. If they catch you browsing illicit material containing children, they'll show up at your door and confront you with it. You get the option of having a meeting with a psychiatrist that is waiting for you, and if you say yes, you are driven there immediately. The therapy session is quite confrontational about the damage that you're doing in supporting the industry that makes child sexual material, and you still get charged for the crime. The goal of the project is to force pedophiles to come to terms with their support of an incredibly harmful industry and to prevent people who are at an early stage from continuing or even worse, acting out on their sexual fantasies. That's the carrot. But you can't have the carrot without the stick. When you're offered help and you refuse to get it, I have no problem with harsher punishments for pedophiles, such as the death penalty, which in a country where the maximum prison sentence is 21 years, with some exceptions, is somewhat controversial. The Norwegian prison system is based on rehabilitation and the belief that every prisoner will eventually be released and could one day be your neighbor. So why wouldn't you want your future neighbor to be set up for a more successful life when they leave prison than they had before they were imprisoned? I support rehabilitation for most crimes, but when it comes to pedophiles who have a sexuality that is just as incurable as heterosexuals and homosexuals, rehabilitation through prison is impossible. That leaves two options: locking them away or execution. And locking someone away for the rest of their life is expensive. I believe harsh punishments are immoral if we as a society refuse to prevent unwanted behavior by funding programs that are meant to help fellow meat sacks who are struggling and only choose to intervene after the crime has been committed and people have been victimized. That's why I support big carrots and even bigger sticks. I hope this rant wasn't too long. If I had more time, I would have written a shorter email. Cheers, Matthias. P.S. If this ever makes it on the podcast, could you give a shout out to my loving fiancée, Andrine? I've been slowly introducing her to the podcast, and I'm hoping she'll become a loyal Timesucker soon. Otherwise, I'll have to break off the engagement. Well, Matthias, holy shit! I love this program you brought up. Fuck yes, this is what needs to happen. I don't hate pedophiles who have never acted on impulses they were very likely born with. I pity them. I mean, what a fucking curse. A true curse that would be. And, we will never find a cure, or at least a strong preventative measure, unless we try to find a cure, try to at least effectively treat people who feel this immoral urge. No one will be rooting for this to work harder than I will, right? What if they actually find out how to essentially cure people of pedophilia someday? How amazing would that be for the children of the world? I love your philosophy. Yes, work to treat it, work hard, and if the treatment in this case does not take, or they reject it, then yeah, bring in the biggest stick, because we have to protect the children. Fascinating. Thank you for sharing. And get the fuck on the train already, Andrine. Otherwise, I've learned your name for nothing, Andrine. And enjoy some Softest for me, the best soft serve ice cream by far I've ever had in my life, and they don't sell it in the States anywhere. I literally start to salivate when I talk about it. It's incredible. Now, one more. From Tyler Jones, a military meat sack, bringing some psychological know-how to last week's episode. Tyler writes, "Hey, Dan, I've been a long-time listener to both Scared to Death and Timesuck for nearly 6 years. Man, thank you. I'm a space lizard, and I love your shows. Timesuck is a perfect podcast when I'm on the road. I'm in the Air Force as a munitions instructor, and I TDY regularly. Temporary duty station, i.e. I travel to various bases. Regardless, your podcast helps to occupy my mind when I'm driving from one place to another. During last week's episode, you mentioned that an expert stated Eileen Wuornos' inconsistent recollection of events should not be perceived as lying due to her mental illness. You were skeptical at best, and I can see how this is hard to believe. But when I heard this, I immediately thought about Wernicke-Korsakoff's syndrome. Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome. I did not find any research that stated directly that she may have had Korsakoff syndrome, but it is possible given her abuse of alcohol over the years. So what is Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome? Without getting into the weeds, it's a type of memory disorder / dementia caused by vitamin B1, or thiamine deficiency. This is typically associated with heavy alcohol abuse. Alcohol inhibits B1 absorption, and continuous alcohol consumption will prevent the brain from receiving vitamin B. One sign of Korsakoff's is for a person to confabulate events, a term I believe coined by William Herstein in his book Brain Fiction, Self-Deception, and the Riddle of Confabulation. Confabulation may appear as a lie to others, but to the individual, it is the truth. For instance, someone suffering with schizophrenia may confabulate about voices they hear or demons they see. With Korsakoff's, a person may be asked a simple question such as, "Why were you late to work?" or "How did you break your arm?" And they will have this elaborate story that seems as if they have pulled it out of thin air. However, they will truly believe what they've said. Again, I couldn't find any data that supported Eileen Wuornos having Korsakoff's, but there are other mental illnesses where a person will confabulate, i.e. schizophrenia, Capgras syndrome, split brain syndrome, Alzheimer's, Anton syndrome, and a few others. The point to my ramble is that lying implies some type of deception, whereas confabulation is more like a non-truth truth, at least to the person confabulating. As someone like me who majored in psychology in college, I thought you would enjoy reading about this. Though I never began a career in psychology, I earned a BAS and MS in psychology simply because I'm fascinated with neurological disorders. If this makes it on the podcast, can I get a shout out to my stepdad, Robert, who first introduced me to Timesuck back in 2019. He got me hooked by suggesting I pick an episode I feel I know the most about and see if I learn anything at the end. So I picked episode 162, Greek Gods, and from there I was hooked. Keep on doing what you do. You help me look forward to the upcoming Mondays. Very respectfully, Tyler. Tyler, holy shit, you're smart. I was so relieved when you mentioned you had a master's degree in psychology. Before that, I was like, how the fuck does he know so much about these rare neurological disorders? And how did he write it out like a college research paper? And you're in the military. Son of a bitch, probably all muscled up and handsome too. Well, after looking into the disorders you mentioned, I have to say I am more open to Eileen not having technically lied, since there is a chance, like you said, that she drank herself into a disorder where she actually lost the ability to understand what was the truth. It actually makes me wonder about an uncle I had who drank himself to death. Last 5 to 10 years of his life, he started telling real tall tales, just getting real crazy. Sadly, we all thought he was just lying a bunch because he hated the truth of what his life had become, but maybe he actually believed the crazy shit he was saying. Disorder or not, I still feel bad for the hand life dealt Eileen, what her experience of most men was like. Thank you for the insight. So many great messages came in this week. So many others I could have shared. Thanks for being the best, you guys. I feel like the people still along for this ride are the best we have ever had.
Thanks, time suckers. I needed that.
We all did.
Well, thank you for listening to another Bad Magic Productions podcast. Scared to Death and Timesuck each week. Short Sucks and Nightmare Fuel in the Timesuck and Scared to Death podcast feed some weeks. Don't overthink some of what Freud said this week. I doubt if you're having a bout of melancholy, it's because, you're sad that you never got to fuck your mom or dad, or because you just don't have a dick. Maybe you're just hungry. Maybe you didn't get enough sleep. Maybe you're low on podcast content, and you'll just need to keep on sucking.
Bad Magic Productions.
And I just want to say at the end here, in honor of Thanksgiving, very thankful, very grateful for the many messages I've been getting this week of just keep doing what you're doing and we'll keep listening. It means a lot. Very inspiring. So thank you. And I hope as I get to spend some time with loved ones that you get to do the same.